just wanted to, welcome everybody here on part of the Masonic College. And just, again, a big shout out to the regents who put in their time and volunteer for this service to the craft. We've had academics, we've had just people that are intellectual and in search of knowledge, but everybody that has taken part to volunteer. And I want to thank all the regents, both present and past, for the work they've done. With that, I want to hand it over to my colleague, Luke Shorty, and being the Dean of the College, he'll give us, again, a little overview of what the college itself does. On to you, Luke. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dan. Much appreciated for that introduction. Good morning, everybody. My name is Luke Shorty. I am a member of Limestone Lodge number 214 up in lovely Aroostook County, though I do work in Lee, Maine, and currently live in Winthrop, Maine. So truly, I cover a large swath of the state. But I have the privilege of being appointed by our chair as the Dean of the Masonic College. And one of the things we've been working on as regents is how do we continue to deliver the type of educational courses that we've offered in the past during this current global pandemic. And now that things have kind of opened up and we've seen what the guidelines are in order to have our gatherings and things like that, we are looking to be offering our courses again in January. But the other thing that we've been working on is a way to kind of stand our courses up virtually. In my occupation as an educator, we've been doing a lot of online classes, especially in the spring of last year when we first were shut down in March. And so we're looking at putting a couple of our courses online through Google Classroom in a type of virtual setting to see if that will be helpful in rolling out some of these courses to people who are interested. So for example, one that we've put on there and is still being tweaked a little bit is the geometry course that I was running last year. And so we'll review those as regents and we'll be meeting actually next weekend to kind of discuss what those next steps are in either online or in-person courses. We are looking for other potential faculty members. So if you know of anyone who would have a knowledge and an understanding and a gift in communicating that knowledge to folks, we'd love to hear from you. We do have a Maine Masonic College email address, and if you we'll get that to you by the end of Convocation. As we wrap up, we'll let you know what that email address is to send any information to us. And with that being said, we do also have an opening or two for some regents. The bylaws of the Maine Masonic College allow us to actually look for regents who aren't necessarily in Maine. There are guidelines, obviously, to make sure that the majority of the regents are Maine Masons. But if there are experts and people that you feel have a skill set that would bring a breadth and depth to our Board of Regents to help improve what we do as a Masonic College, we would love to have those names as well. It's nice to see folks here, albeit virtually, but I'm really excited for today's presentation. Convocation and the celebration of arts and science are two touch points that we do as a Masonic College. And so I'm excited to see this third installation on civility and talking about history and the different perspectives that Masonry has brought in the formation of our country from both sides of the conflict. So with that being said, Mr. Chair, I cede my time and thank you all very much. I look forward to the discussion today.
Thank you very much, Luke. So we're going to be early on schedule, which is always nice. So With that, I just wanted to welcome Jessica, and thank you so much for spending the time today to discuss your interesting area of expertise. This is going to be quite fascinating. So, if you don't mind, I'm more than happy to hand it over to you now. Since we're recording, we can obviously I'll take care of administering anybody that arrives late. So, if you're ready, I would hand the floor over to you.
Actually, I hate to interrupt, but the Grand Master was going to give us an introduction as well, Dan.
Absolutely,
Yeah,
absolutely.
he sent me a 10-page bio, but I lost it. And I also lost the fanfare tape that I was supposed to be playing with it. But no,
Right,
I just want to jump in because I'm going to use that intro later on when he presents. But I just want to say anybody who uses a bridge analogy on his introductory article in the Maine Mason is okay with me. So
fantastic, then. Most worshipful.
yeah, I think
You
you're on too.
Unmute there, most worshipful.
You know what? I've been on multiple Zoom meetings per week, and somehow that mute button still escapes me when I get going. Maybe that's a sign that I should just kind of settle down and be quiet. Thank you very much for having me here with all of you this morning. George alluded to the bridge on the cover of the Maine Mason, and I like to think of what the Masonic College does as a bridge that spans actually the metaphysical world to the physical world. When we consider that I see I think it's on George's email always that stretching the mind. Once the mind has been stretched, it can never regain its original size or form or whatever it is, something like that. And that's the truth. When we consider the education that's brought forward in any capacity, and especially in the Masonic College, we're taking an idea and actually expanding that idea and moving it into a world where we can utilize that idea. So it's essentially we're going from metaphysical to a physical world. When we think about the mind and the brain, of course, we know they're both completely different. But the education is the key. The education is what is going to continue to bring more light to our brethren and non-brethren alike, to anybody who's learned. I've been a chiropractor for 22 years. And from what I'm told, the phrase doctor means teacher. And so I really would have to thank all of you who are teaching and bringing these ideas to fruition through education for anybody who attends the college or participates in any of the activities of the college. So I want to thank you all, Brother President, Brother Chair, and our guest speakers today. I'm looking forward to this program. So I told you I would keep it short and sweet. So there you go.
Thank you again, most worshipful. Jessica, feel free to take your time, take a break if you need. Would you like screen sharing for any materials you want to present?
Yes, I will be sharing my screen. Shall I go ahead and set that up now?
Yeah, I believe I can make you a co-host.
Yes, please.
Which you are now with co-host status. I believe you'll be able to do screen sharing. I will be watching and administering as needed. So just drop me a note or speak out if you need anything else.
All right, let me just grab the right screen. How's that?
That looks good. Perfect.
Excellent. Well, I would like to start off by expressing my appreciation to the Maine Masonic College for this convocation and college for this invitation, and to George in particular for his actual seamless organizing in the face of our challenges. It's been impressive that we've been able to maintain this event, and here we are this morning. So I'm going to do a talk of about 40 minutes, and I have lots of slides to show you with historical documents and images. I'm happy to field any questions at the end, and whether we do that through the chat or the just having you speak and participate in a conversation, or some combination of both, I'm happy to discuss things further after my presentation. Okay, so let me move my screen over and then I'll be able to get started here. On June 24th, 1785, the Brethren of Halifax, Nova Scotia, gathered to celebrate the festival of St. John. They donned their Masonic regalia. They assembled into their lodges. There were about 13 under the jurisdiction of the Grand Lodge of Nova Scotia at the time, Provincial Grand Lodge, that is, and marched in procession to St. Paul's Church, where they took part in a service conducted by Reverend Joshua Wingate Weeks. In his sermon, the Reverend expounded on what he called the cultivation of social love and on the many responsibilities and benefits of belonging to the free and accepted Masons. He told the assembled brethren that their membership in Freemasonry constituted a key, and that was the word he used, a key, that would give them admittance to the brotherhood anywhere in the world. As you can see here from this quote, he said, "Were the providence of God to cast you on an unknown shore, were you to travel through any distant country, though ignorant of its language, ignorant of its inhabitants, and ignorant of its customs," he assured his listeners, "the key would give them access to a cordial reception and kind entertainment, and would, quote, open the treasures of Masonic charity." Weeks was right. By 1785, a British Freemason could travel to just about any part of the empire and find a lodge. Spreading out from Britain since the 1730s, the Brotherhood had established a presence in Europe, in the Mediterranean colonies of the British Empire, such as Gibraltar and Minorca, in India and the islands of the Indian Ocean, like Mauritius, and most especially throughout the British Atlantic world, the British Isles themselves, the North American colonies from Newfoundland to Florida. And notice I didn't just focus on the 13 colonies there, and across the British Caribbean. Today, I want to look at the history of Freemasonry in one particular corner of the Atlantic world, your corner, Maine, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick. Focusing on the second half of the 18th century, I'll use documents and examples from New England and the Maritimes to examine these four aspects of Freemasonry. First, how Freemasonry's vast network came into being. So I'll be looking at the mechanisms by which it spread from the British Isles across the Atlantic and throughout the world. Second, I want to look at the emergence of a schism within English Freemasonry and other reasons why 18th century Freemasons were concerned, in fact, obsessed with regularity. That was their term. Third, the process by which Freemasonry became a discrete, well-organized, and recognizable institution with a functioning and adaptable administration, one that was very well geared towards expansion of both the Brotherhood itself and the broader empire of which it was a part. And in the book that this talk is based on, my central purpose is to explore the reciprocal relationship between Freemasonry and the British Empire, how they both contributed to one another over the 18th and 19th and early 20th centuries. Finally, what did it mean to be a Freemason in the 18th century Atlantic world? Why did men join? What needs did membership meet? By the mid-18th century, Freemasonry was not only important to the men who joined it, it also played a significant role in creating and integrating the Atlantic world. Emerging in the 1600s with the first colonial settlements in Ireland, Newfoundland, Massachusetts, and Virginia, the British Atlantic world had become, by the mid-18th century, the fulcrum of Britain's expanding global empire. It was, to quote geographer D.W. Meinig, the scene of a vast interaction, a sudden and harsh encounter between two old worlds that transformed both and integrated them into a single new world. The vastness, operation, and complexities of this Atlantic system have come fully into view only in recent decades. Traditionally, most historians have approached history using nations, not oceans, as their primary unit of analysis. And this is probably how most of you learned history in school. The story of the American nation, the English nation, the Canadian nation. This approach, while important, obscures how people and places interacted across national boundaries or pre-national boundaries and across maritime basins. how 8 oceans and the peoples, products, and institutions that regularly crossed them connected the shores of the British Isles to those of West Africa, North America, the Caribbean, and the Southern Atlantic. To recover this history, a new and vibrant subfield has emerged, appropriately known as Atlantic history. Historians who embrace this method study, in the words of historian John Elliott, quote, the creation, destruction, and recreation of communities as a result of the movement across and around the Atlantic basin of peoples, commodities, and cultural practices. So at this point, we have broad sweeping comparative studies of Atlantic empires. We have deep examinations of particular colonies, port cities, and conflicts. We have sophisticated analyses tracking Atlantic commodities, cod, tobacco, rice, and especially slaves. We have fascinating explorations of Atlantic lives. And this is just to highlight and name a few of the works in Atlantic history that have come out in recent years. Where was Freemasonry in all of this? Well, it ranks among the most important cultural institutions that helped create and integrate this world. Of course, trade was crucial, and empires provided transatlantic political structures, not to mention the rivalries that led to their navies and armies crisscrossing the basin. Migration was an obvious integrative force as well. But among the merchants, colonial administrators, soldiers, and settlers were Freemasons. Men who joined the Brotherhood before they left British shores or somewhere along the way during their journeys. As more and more men joined and more lodges formed, Freemasonry's networks expanded first to Atlantic and then to global proportions. Okay, so what was going on with Freemasons in your corner of the Atlantic world during the second half of the 18th century? I want to look at the 4 aspects of Freemasonry that I just mentioned: its diffusion, its internal rivalries, its institutionalization, and its functions, by focusing on a primary document. Now, this primary document should be of particular interest to you. I know it's impossible to read in this screen. I just want to show it to you as a whole. And then as I zoom into the document, I will have transcriptions of the texts for you to follow. But this is the big picture view. So this is the warrant of Falmouth Lodge, issued to Freemasons in what would eventually become Portland, Maine, by the Provincial Grand Lodge of Boston in 1769. Along the way, I'm going to refer to other key documents that help put local developments in their broader context and show how Freemasons in this region were part of an expansive Atlantic network. But I'll be focusing primarily on this warrant. All right, so this charter was typical of the warrants, and you can use the term charter or warrant interchangeably. I don't know if they were more likely to use warrant on the British side of things and charter on the American side of things, because most of the ones that I came across were referred to as warrants. But this is typical of warrants used to establish lodges across the British Empire during the 18th century. So just again, to point out some of the features, this first part is the salutation from John Rowe, Provincial Grand Master for all North America. And he, in this first paragraph, he basically sends his greetings to the Masons in the area. And then this second paragraph, I assume, can you see my cursor? Okay. So this second paragraph essentially recounts an earlier attempt by one Alexander Ross to set up a lodge at Falmouth that didn't work out because he ended up dying. But this is really where I want to dive into today, this third and longer paragraph. Okay, so this is the first part of that third paragraph, and this is the transcription of the text. Now, therefore, know ye that we of the great trust, power, and authority reposed in us by his grace, Henry Somerset, Duke of Beaufort, Grand Master of Masons, have nominated and appointed our well-beloved brother William Ting, Esquire, to be the first master of the lodge at Falmouth, and do hereby empower him to congregate the brethren together and form them into a regular lodge, he taking special care that all and every member thereof, and all transient persons admitted therein, have been or shall be regular made Masons, and that he goes on and he appoints 2 wardens for the due regulation thereof for 1 year. The founding of Falmouth Lodge illustrates one of the principal ways Freemasonry spread across the British Empire during the 18th century. It was established as a result of a provincial Grand Lodge giving permission for a group of local Masons to set up a new lodge. Provincial Grand Lodges were established by the English, Irish, and Scottish Grand Lodges wherever a strong Masonic presence had emerged, or wherever they anticipated Freemasonry would take off. The provincial Grand Master served as the Grand Master's representative in a locality. In this way, he was much like the governor representing the king or the queen as the central administrator in a colony. So he was responsible for keeping the registers of lodges and members, collecting fees, corresponding with the Grand Lodge in the metropole. And when I use the term metropole, I'm basically referring back to the British Isles. It's the academic term for sort of mother country, okay? So if I say metropole or metropolitan, I'm referring back to England primarily. So he's corresponding with Grand Lodge authorities back in the metropole and keeping lodges and brethren in line. Most importantly, for the spread of Freemasonry, the provincial Grand Master had the authority to warrant new lodges. So I'll give you a few quick examples from around the 18th century Atlantic world. William Matthew was appointed provincial Grand Master of the Leeward Islands in the Caribbean in 1738, which is pretty early in the history of Freemasonry. Within 5 years, he had set up 2 lodges in Antigua and 2 in St. Kitts. And now this is an interesting case because Matthew served both as provincial Grand Master of English Freemasonry and governor of the Leeward Islands. And this pattern would be repeated across the empire moving forward. And it demonstrates this reciprocal relationship that I described earlier between Freemasonry and the British Empire. Sorry, there we go. Okay, so the second example is this one, the Provincial Grand Lodge of Boston, which warranted the lodge at Falmouth. It had been set up also quite early in 1733 with the merchant tailor Henry Price as first provincial Grand Master. Price reported to London in 1755, quote, "Masonry has had as great a success in America since my settling here as in any part of the world." But then he added parenthetically, except England. So he wanted to acknowledge their precedence. And indeed, by this point, the Provincial Grand Lodge had issued warrants for lodges to meet not only in New England, and so you can see on the list of lodges founded in these early years, but also in Canada and even the Caribbean, another lodge established by the Provincial Grand Lodge of Boston in Antigua. By the 1780s, this is the third example, Freemasonry was sufficiently established in Quebec to justify the colony having its own Provincial Grand Lodge. In 1789, Provincial Grand Lodge officers reported to the Grand Lodge of England that they had issued warrants to constitute 2 lodges in New Brunswick. New Brunswick Lodge, which they described as, quote, composed of a number of gentlemen residents in that province, and then a second lodge to be formed in the, quote, new settlements above Montreal. So this is a map of with a chronology that I've imposed on it that shows the founding dates of the English provincial Grand Lodges. And it's really interesting because you can sort of track the history and spread of the British Empire by looking at the dates of the founding of provincial Grand Lodges of Freemasonry. So the earliest ones, and this doesn't have all of them, it's more just to give you a kind of representation of Freemasonry spread, but the earliest ones obviously here in the Atlantic region, and then moving across to Asia and India, Australia, and then ultimately into the African continent. The other primary way that Freemasonry was diffused around the Atlantic world, and indeed the broader empire, was through lodges attached to British Army regiments. Britain was engaged in almost continuous warfare with its rivals Spain and France during the 18th century. And I've listed the primary conflicts on this timeline. So think about all the British regiments moving back and forth across the Atlantic and around the world as a result of these wars. By the end of the century, almost every regiment had at least one Masonic lodge in its ranks, and many regiments had several Masonic lodges. Their traveling warrants, as they were known, gave them authority to meet as a lodge anywhere in the world. Traveling warrants had been invented by the Grand Lodge of Ireland in the 1730s. Here's the first one from 1732. So this is a facsimile of the original, and then I'm going to give you a view that's easier to decipher here. So the Grand Lodge of Ireland issued this warrant to a lodge in the 1st Battalion in the Royal Scots, which was the oldest regiment of the line. It was active for nearly a century and met all around the world as the regiment moved from place to place. Between 1732 and 1813, the Irish warranted nearly 200 such lodges. This table mentions the ancients and moderns. I'll come back to those in the second section of my talk. So not only did almost every regiment eventually host a lodge, many had several. 4 regiments had at least one Irish, Scottish, and English lodge. The Royal Artillery had 28 ancient lodges. The estimate for the total number of regimental lodges is around 500. As Irish Masonic historian Chetwood Crawley put it, quote, "These lodges permeated everywhere. Everywhere they left behind the germs of Freemasonry." And I should mention, I didn't really pay attention to that quote and that particular word until we were in the midst of a pandemic. He means germs as, seeds in a very positive way. So indeed, the traveling lodges not only allowed military Freemasons to meet anywhere in the world, they also planted Freemasonry abroad. When a regiment departed a garrison town or a colony, civilians who had joined the lodge would continue meeting and eventually receive their own warrant. I'll come back to that in a few minutes when we talk about the founding of some of the lodges in New Brunswick. But returning to Falmouth, perhaps it was through a military lodge that William Tyng and the 11 others who formed the lodge had first encountered Freemasonry. So this is a slide that has the wars that I was just talking about, with the founding dates of lodges in your region superimposed on them in blue. So Falmouth Lodge came into existence in the immediate aftermath of the 7 Years' War. And on our side of the pond, that's usually referred to as the French and Indian War. Many regiments had been circulating through these parts during the conflict. And Tyng himself had connections to the Army. After settling in Falmouth and serving as Cumberland County Sheriff, he would go on to join the Army, receiving a commission as colonel from Governor Gage in 1774. And so as Freemasonry became established in the region that would eventually become the state of Maine, you can track a lot of its early lodges to this period, the period of the 7 Years' War, the period of the American Revolution. There were 3 lodges founded in the 1790s, so a total of 5 working by the turn of the century. And then after the conflict, a period of significant and impressive growth with another 25 lodges established by 1825. And so then that's the moment where, and I'm not going to have time to talk about it today, but we see the coterminous emergence of both the state of Maine and the Grand Lodge of Maine. So turning to New Brunswick for a second, in 1784, meanwhile, we see the founding of the colony of New Brunswick, as well as the establishment of Hiram Lodge number 17 in St. John. The lodge was short-lived, only 12 years, but its history shows the importance of military lodges in spreading Freemasonry. The lodge was composed primarily of Freemasons among the Loyalist refugees arriving from New York. 5 of the founders had been members of Ancient Lodge number 169 and 2 other lodges in New York. According to Dr. Bonnie Huskins, military lodges were also operating in St. John during the decade. She cites the report of the New Brunswick Royal Gazette, quote, that the brethren of the 54th Regimental Lodge assembled on the 16th of December, 1786, to hear a sermon by Rector George Bizet on, quote, the pleasures and advantages of brotherly unity. And that members of the new Hiram Lodge even complained to the authorities in Halifax that a lodge in the Royal Artillery, the one that I just mentioned that had 28 of them, was attempting to initiate civilians. So Huskins concludes, it's clear that military lodges brought Masonic knowledge and experience to settlements such as St. John. Okay, moving on to my second section, regularity and rivalry. So going back to the warrant, you'll notice that the first paragraph uses the word regular twice, empower him to congregate brethren together and form them into a regular lodge, and also telling him to make sure that all transient persons admitted are regular made Masons. It also states that Ting is to appoint 2 wardens to oversee and due regulation of the lodge. So this points to the fact that at this time, the world of Freemasonry was dealing with irregularities, with rivalries, with breaches. And in fact, the very existence of documents such as the warrant indicate Grand Lodge's efforts to regularize and regulate Freemasonry. So concern with regularity is evident in another class of Masonic documents that I want to show you, and then I'll come back to what was going on in the warrant. So these also emerged in this period, and also as a result of the Grand Lodge of Ireland. These are Masonic certificates. The Grand Lodge of Ireland was the first Grand Lodge to issue certificates to individual brethren. It developed this administrative mechanism as a response to the fact that so many of its members were on the move. They were traveling at great distances, not just across the British Isles and Europe, but throughout the empire and the world. And they needed a way to prove themselves as legitimate Freemasons to brethren who didn't know them personally. So here are a couple of examples. This is the certificate of William Foreman. And you can see from this, you probably can't make out the text, but I've bracketed it off here and transcribed it to the side, that it says to prospective lodges that he may be legally admitted into any assembly of Masons wherever held or congregated. And then this is one of my favorite certificates. That's not from the Atlantic world, and it's from a little bit later, 1813, but it's absolutely fascinating. This is the certificate of Charles Wallington, who had been made a Mason in the Lodge of True Friendship in Calcutta in 1813. And it recommends him to all men enlightened wherever spread on the face of the globe. And I don't know if you can make it out, but this side is in English, and this side has the same text in French. And so it was common in this period for British Freemasons to find themselves captured by the French. In fact, one of the reasons attributed to the spread of Freemasonry among Britons in India at the time was because Freemasonry had a well-known reputation for helping brethren out were they to become captured during the wars against France. This encouraged a membership because it could help ease their treatment while they were in captivity. So a regular made Mason was one who could demonstrate his knowledge of Masonic passwords, hand grips, and rituals, and perhaps also produce one of these certificates. And a regular lodge was one that had been appropriately warranted by a Grand Lodge or one of its provincial Grand Lodges. But there was a further complicating factor when it came to regularity. When the Lodge of Falmouth came into being, there were actually 2 English Grand Lodges, and actually even a third if you include one that was based in York, England, and had sort of revived in the 1760s. But back to the main rivalry, in the mid-1750s, a second Grand Lodge had emerged in the British Isles to rival the Grand Lodge that had been established in London in 1717. Claiming a truer lineage, its founders described themselves as the most ancient and honorable society of free and accepted Masons. And this sort of ended up sticking the original Grand Lodge with the name Moderns. The ancients were a scrappy, enthusiastic, and well-organized bunch. Their earliest lodges, the ones that had formed the Grand Lodge in England, you can see here that they're meeting as a committee in 1751 as a result of these lodges that had been meeting since the 1740s. So they were composed primarily of Irish migrants who had not been able to gain access into English lodges, migrants to England, okay, and in particular London. Out in the colonies, ancient lodges tended to draw members from the middling ranks, so from the artisans, small merchants, soldiers, while the moderns remained more the preserve of colonial elites. And in his really excellent book, Revolutionary Brotherhood, Dr. Stephen Bullock traces the playing out of this rivalry within the context of the 13 colonies. The ancients were also very responsive to the opportunities presented for Freemasonry's growth. As that table that I just showed you demonstrates, they were second only to the Irish Grand Lodge in issuing warrants to lodges and regiments, with 108 behind the 190 issued by the Grand Lodge of Ireland. The schism was at its height when the lodge at Falmouth emerged in 1769. So when its warrant refers to a regular lodge and regular-made Freemasons, it's claiming that these Masons at Falmouth are legitimate. They meet under the authority of the Provincial Grand Lodge at Boston, which in turn meets under the authority of the Duke of Beaufort, Grand Master of the Premier Grand Lodge of England between 1767 and 1772. Let me see where. Yep, so there's a picture of the Duke of Beaufort. Although the moderns were well established in cities like Boston and New York, the ancients gained an impressive presence across the American colonies, and their activities spurred the moderns to get their own house in order and also geared their administration towards expansion. So they adopt all of these mechanisms that I've been talking about, the use of certificates, the traveling warrants, as I've shown, and many of the other things that the Grand Lodge of Ireland and then the ancients, because of their close relationship with the Grand Lodge of Ireland, had already put into practice. So I would say that while the rivalry was challenging and difficult and created dissension within Freemasonry, in a way it was kind of a productive rivalry because it contributed to the broadening of the social base of Freemasonry's membership, as well as its diffusion across the Atlantic and the empire. A final word about the preoccupation with regularity that we see in the use of certificates and the language of the warrant. It stemmed not only from concern about rivals within the Brotherhood, but also about fear of imposters. In 1786, the modern Grand Lodge printed and distributed a circular to all of its subordinate lodges, including the ones in England itself, warning them that imposture was a widespread problem afflicting the fraternity. Grand Lodge officials cautioned that, quote, many idle persons were traveling about the country, and this is their language, some particularly in the dress of Turks or Moors. Why? Well, the circular goes on to explain that under the sanction of certificates and pretending to be distressed Masons, they impose upon the benevolence of many lodges and brethren. So think about this. Freemasonry's reputation for mutual assistance and benevolence had become so well known by the 1780s that it attracted crafty imposters seeking to gain access to membership benefits. And Freemasonry's network of lodges stretched so far and wide by this point that it made sense for English imposters to pose as Muslims and Turks in their attempts to infiltrate lodges and impose on the benevolence of their membership. And I'll come back to Masonic benevolence in my last section. But first, some thoughts about how Freemasonry became institutionalized in this period. Okay, so now we'll move on to the second part of that long middle paragraph in the warrant. And we do hereby give to said lodge all the privileges and authority of stated lodges, requiring them to observe all and every of the regulations contained in the printed book of constitutions to be kept and observed. And also such other rules and instructions as shall be from time to time transmitted to them by us. So the new lodge at Falmouth is ordered to observe regulations in the Book of Constitutions and any other rules and instructions the Grand Lodge saw fit to promulgate. The Book of Constitutions played an absolutely central role in Freemasonry's institutionalization, as well as in the formulation of Masonic ideology and the fraternity's diffusion. And by ideology, I just mean the set of ideas underlying Freemasonry and its organization. So Reverend James Anderson, who was one of the founders of the English Grand Lodge, wrote and published the original constitutions in 1723. It included not only Anderson's lengthy disquisition on the Brotherhood's supposedly ancient origins, but also his compilation of the charges of a Freemason. Of course, Benjamin Franklin reprinted Anderson's volume, and then you can see, I don't know if you can make it out, but in this section, it says, for the use of the brethren in North America in Philadelphia in 1734. As copies of the constitutions began circulating around North American lodges, they created a uniformity of practice and a standardized set of expectations for Freemasons' behavior. They also codified the central aspects of the brothers' ideology of fraternal cosmopolitanism, belief in the great architect of the universe, the practice of toleration and inclusiveness, a sense of membership in a universal human family, the ability to feel at home anywhere in the world, and a commitment to the practice of love and benevolence. Thus, a Freemason in Dublin or Jamaica or Falmouth, when made familiar with the sixth charge, for example, would know that he was not allowed to bring religious or political discussions within the door of the lodge. Learning about and abiding by the charges connected brethren not only across space, but also across time. They continue to serve, as you know, of the Brotherhood's foundation to this day. The next section of the charter has further evidence of the fact that Freemasonry had developed into a strong institution with an increasingly sophisticated administration. And it was an administration that was becoming increasingly capable of responding to and managing the fraternity's global growth. So I won't read this section, but you can see it refers to accounting and bookkeeping. Subordinate lodges like the one at Falmouth were to send an annual return. And indeed, the transmission of these returns and other letters, forms, publications led to the creation of a vast correspondence network that connected brethren on both sides of the Atlantic. And then in the last part of this section, like any self-respecting institutional bureaucracy, the Grand Lodge demanded fees, 3 guineas for a warrant. Now, adjusted for inflation, 3 guineas would be over 600 pounds today. So it was not an insignificant amount. If the lodge complied with all of these requirements and maintained its good standing, it would be included on the list of lodges that was kept in the Grand Lodge in London. This is the first printed edition of London's list of lodges, again, dating from the 1730s. A lot was happening in the Masonic world in the 1730s. And you can see they didn't end up maintaining this over the course of the 18th century because there were just too many lodges. But the idea was to keep a list of which lodges were regular, and it would say where and when the lodge met. Obviously, this is important for visiting brethren to know where to go and when to be there for a meeting. A book of constitutions, a set of charges, a list of lodges, a correspondence system, the remittance of fees, the issuing of certificates and warrants, all of these point to the fact that Freemasonry developed its essential institutional structures during the 18th century, and it did so in the context of the growth of Britain's Atlantic colonies and broader empire. The result was a vast interconnected network that brought Freemasons in New England and the Maritimes into regular contact and fraternal obligation with their brethren up and down the eastern seaboard, in the Caribbean, and across the ocean in the British Isles. And I have to say that it was thrilling when I was conducting my research in the Grand Lodge of London, the Grand Lodge of Ireland, to come across packets of letters that were folded and stacked and tied with a string that I don't think had really been opened for decades, if not centuries. And seeing these returns, seeing the reports from the provincial Grand Masters and the local lodges. And it really gives you a sense of how these institutional practices and the correspondence that they generated knit the brotherhood together across the Atlantic region. Finally, the pleasures and advantages of brotherly unity, the functions of Freemasonry. And I take that, the beginning of that section title from the Bizet sermon that the brethren in New Brunswick heard in 1786 that I referred to earlier. So you can see we're all the way down here now at the bottom in this section of the warrant. The last paragraph of the warrant tells the brethren at Falmouth that they must annually keep the feast of St. John the Baptist or St. John the Evangelist, or both, and dine together on said day or days. And second, that they regularly send such charity as their lodge shall think fit for the relief of poor brethren, with the names of those that contributed the same, in case that any such may come to want relief, and that they may have the preference to others. These final instructions point to two of the many important functions Freemasonry performed in colonial societies. First, the requirement to observe St. John's Day demonstrates how the brotherhood fulfilled ceremonial, religious, and convivial needs. Returning to the episode with which I opened, the brethren in Nova Scotia, in Halifax, marched in a public procession. So public Masonic professions were extremely common in the 18th, 19th, and early 20th century. Freemasonry was very much a public institution, and they marched all over the place together as lodges. In this case, they went to a church where they heard the sermon in which Reverend Weeks told them that as Masons, they were in possession of this very special key. And the fact that they were attending the church service shows that Freemasons were joining in part because they understood its importance to their religious lives. After the procession, the brethren would have adjourned to a private location and convened their lodges. And then following the lodge meeting, they would have remained assembled to share a meal. In fact, the warrant instructs them to share a meal together. The festivities, punctuated by frequent toast making and other rituals of sociability, could last long into the night. Now, the practice of observing St. John's Day in this manner was repeated over and over again across the Atlantic world, year after year. It serves as an outstanding example of the associational culture that defined the lives of middle and upper class men in Britain, Ireland, and the colonies. Finally, the requirement that the Falmouth Masons send money to support the charity funds of the Provincial Grand Lodge in Boston. As we have seen, Masonic benevolence became so well known that imposters regularly impersonated members in order to take advantage of lodge charity. Fraternal bonds formed through rituals and refreshment translated into forms of direct assistance. I'll give you some examples. In the 1730s, the Grand Lodge of England made generous contributions to help send distressed brethren to the new colony of Georgia, quote, where they might be comfortably provided for. Most of them, as you know from the history of Georgia, were debtors. In the middle of the 7 Years' War, Quebec lodges reported that they extended their charity not only to distressed brethren, but to, quote, some hundreds of poor, miserable Canadians during the course of a long and severe winter. When a hurricane ripped through Barbados in October 1789, members of St. Michael's Lodge on the island helped build, quote, temporary habitations and assisted one brother who had been, quote, completely reduced to want. The next year, Masonic officials in Nova Scotia reported that in 6 years, the Provincial Grand Lodge had given away over £365 to many, quote, traveling brethren from England, Scotland, and Ireland, driven to distress by diverse misfortunes in this distant part of His Majesty's dominions. And indeed, the pages of Masonic records from the period are chock full of examples, such as these, of Freemasons engaged in acts of brotherly relief, not only to fellow members, but also to non-members experiencing crises and dealing with the vicissitudes of life in the 18th century. Of course, 18th century men joined Freemasonry for other reasons as well: to study the esoteric teachings and history of the Brotherhood, or to pursue moral improvement of themselves and society. Somewhat less loftily, men became Masons in order to put their membership in a prestigious fraternity on public display via St. John's Day ceremonies like the ones I've just described, or ceremonies to mark the comings and goings of governors and other colonial officials, or ceremonies such as this one represented here, which were ubiquitous foundation stone laying ceremonies as brick by brick, the British built their global empire. Many sought admission in order to help advance their careers and climb the social ladder. But regardless of their specific reasons for joining, Masons in 18th century Falmouth, Halifax, St. John, and beyond became part of a fraternity that had firmly established itself across the Atlantic world. It had developed a sophisticated administration that regulated and monitored the membership, and it promoted an ideology of fraternal cosmopolitanism that resonated with men who led colonial lives. In the process, Freemasonry itself became a force that connected and integrated the Atlantic world. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that presentation. You're getting applause via Zoom here.
Okay.
I know that I wrote down several questions on this one. I hope other people have too. It'd be nice to have a discussion following up on all these points that were made. So I'm going to shut off your screen sharing if we can and open it up to the floor. I am happy to have somebody present the question. I think with this group, we could probably manage to do it just by raising your hand and being recognized. And from there, we can go forward. Yes, go ahead, George and Donnie, and don't forget to unmute yourself.
Okay, I think I am unmuted.
Yes, you are.
I want to thank Jessica for that wonderful presentation. I want to point out too, because I don't think people might realize that she's coming to us from Florida, where she's an associate professor of history at the University of Florida. So long ways through the wires here. I'm impressed. I was just curious, and you know, there's no way you can become a Mason, obviously, you're a woman. Why did you pick this kind of a topic for your studies? What interested you into doing this?
Yeah, well, first let me respond to your point about my being in Florida. I have to say I was really looking forward to coming to Maine after a very long and trying summer, which continues. I know you probably don't have much sympathy for me that it's still almost 90 degrees here. But I had hoped for a change of season and to see your beautiful state. My daughter's currently in school in Boston, well, sort of as much as anyone is in school these days. And so I had hoped to see her and come up to Maine and meet all of you, but maybe another year. Okay, so how did I become interested in Freemasonry? Only late in the development of my research did I realize that I had even had family members who were Masons. I was not aware of Freemasonry very much growing up. And my father had not been a Freemason, nor maybe some of my distant ancestors, probably, but not any that I was aware of. So the reason I became interested in this topic was because I had been studying in Cambridge before attending graduate school. And I heard a lecture about a rebellion that took place in Ireland in 1798. Perhaps some of you know about the United Irish Rebellion. I know Liam does. He's going to be talking soon. And the professor had talked about the role of Masonic lodges in spreading revolutionary activity and ideas. Now, of course, they weren't supposed to. If they followed by the rules of Freemasonry, they wouldn't have been engaged in revolutionary activity. But nonetheless, in the turbulence of the 1790s, that's what happened with Masonic lodges in Ireland. And in fact, up to that point, Irish lodges had included both Catholics and Protestants. And the Brotherhood was especially involved with the Society of United Irishmen that had spurred this rebellion against British rule. So I would talk to the professor after class. I said, I'd heard of the Freemasons, but I didn't really know what they were. And he gave me a brief background, and I left it at that. On the plane ride back to the United States that summer, I just happened to be reading Kipling and the novel Kim, which is about, as many of you know, I'm sure, an orphan boy in India in the 1830s, 40s, a little bit later than the United Irish Rebellion. And Kim spends his whole time trying to evade Masonic officials because his father had died. His father had been a Mason, and he was slated to go to a Masonic orphanage, and he did not want to end up in a Masonic orphanage. He wanted to travel around the subcontinent. And so I wondered, wow, the Freemasons were in Ireland in the 1790s, and they're in India in the mid-19th century. What the heck is going on? So by the time I got to graduate school, I was beginning to formulate this as a possible research topic. But I approached my advisor, Dr. John Sell, who was a historian of the British Empire, and sort of pitched the topic to him. And he looked at me and said, "But Jessica, it's a secret society. How are you going to get the records?" And then he said, "And Jessica, you're a woman. It's a fraternity. How are you going to get the records?" So I had to prove to him that I could actually research this topic. And I received some funding to go to Canada that next summer, where I went to the Grand Lodge in the province of Ontario. And they opened their archive to me. They were extremely helpful in showing me documents and talking to me about the fraternity. This was in the 90s, late 90s. They even gave me free access to their photocopier, which for a graduate student in history was a really big deal. So I copied a lot of articles out of their periodicals. They had collections that really touched on all of these aspects that I've been describing today. And that turned into my the research from that turned into my master's thesis. And then from there, because I had received such a warm welcome from Freemasons Ontario, I was able to travel to the Grand Lodge in England and the Grand Lodge in Ireland. And my timing was lucky. This was at a moment where these Grand Lodges were very much interested in increasing their public presence, in making their archives accessible. And so that enabled me to conduct my research. If I had done it a decade or so earlier, or even earlier than that, obviously, I probably wouldn't have been able to do the project.
Fantastic. That's it's interesting because when it comes to Freemasonry, a lot of it actually is shareable with the public. I mean, I think really the secrets that the fraternity keep are maybe some moral lessons, definitely the obligations and some recognition signals. But I mean, most of the rest of Freemasonry is actually available to the public if they just are interested. Yeah. Any other questions? A second question from the floor? Yep, go ahead, Luke.
Thank you so much, Jessica. That was an awesome presentation. I really enjoyed it. What I find fascinating is if you think about the different types of, I really found it fascinating to pivot instead of looking at nations historically to look at oceans, right? Like Atlantic history, Pacific history. I think that's a fascinating way to kind of study history. But one thing I found equally fascinating is you've got these different kind of, I'm trying to find the right word for it, structures. We'll just say social structures, right? You've got the fraternal Masonic structure, but then you have this national political structure that if you look at the American Atlantic coast, you've got these two major political structures in this emerging American political structure where there's a lot of volatility in that political sphere. It seems like the Masonic sphere was still pretty stable. Like I might not be a loyalist, but I could still kind of go to lodge with loyalists. Is that fairly accurate in the research that you saw? Or like those loyalists who are like, yo, we're leaving New York right now. The lodges they were going to, were they open to people who might not have been loyalists? How did that work when you have one social structure that's super volatile and one that appears to be pretty darn smooth during that same time frame?
Yeah, no, great question. And then I'll come back to your point about Atlantic history as well.
Yeah.
So I think it depends entirely on what time period you're looking at. And I think in the 1760s and 70s, early 1770s, you could find lodges that had representation from fairly diverse political perspectives. And then again, by the mid 1780s, the healing of the breach, so to speak, is pretty rapid. But I would say right during the time period of the war, and maybe Liam will be talking about this a little bit further, right during the period of the war, loyalists and patriots really weren't socializing together, even in Masonic lodges. Loyalists were being, hounded out of town, or on the other side, if you were a revolutionary or a rebel in a loyalist area, you were being sent off to other colonies. But you often see this in Masonic publications or websites. There's a great desire to associate Freemasonry with the revolutionaries, and there's no question that there were connections, that there were Masons among the rebels, but there were also lots and lots of Masons among the loyalists. And one of the arguments that I look at in the book is how Freemasonry was sort of flexible enough to be adapted to different political agendas. Again, this was not supposed to happen within Freemasonry, but men did it. And that was a key characteristic. Just like you could find multiple religions represented, you could also find multiple political perspectives represented. I did come across a note when I was doing research for this talk that Falmouth Lodge for a while actually alternated the ritual between ancient and moderns to sort of bring people together. Now, I don't know if that's based in documents, but I wouldn't be surprised if on occasion that did happen. So as to Atlantic history, yeah, it's still within the academy, at least it's very well established. It's established enough to have its own critics, and I'm actually sympathetic to many of the criticisms of Atlantic history. I won't go into all of that at this point, but I don't know that it's really filtered down yet to the schools and to the teaching of history. But certainly we're seeing a lot of work that is exploring these interconnections across the nation state boundaries. And I would just sort of make a pitch. We have a new book, Bonnie, Elizabeth Mankey, and a colleague, Jan Janssen, have a new book coming out called The Fraternal Atlantic. And there are articles about Freemasonry using this Atlantic perspective. I actually just received the page proof, so it should be coming out in the next few months, published by Routledge Press. Yep.
It makes total sense anyway that, the bodies of water at the time were the highways. I mean, it was very difficult to cross country in the North American continent. So in a lot of ways, they say it was easier to actually be connected via water.
Yeah, they weren't moats; they were bridges. To go back to George's original metaphor.
I have a question or two I'd like to toss out that actually follows on this theme. You were talking about, and this might be ahead of your era of research, but you were talking about how Freemasonry became kind of for the common man eventually, through the schism, and then eventually the kind of coming together of the two bodies. Originally, how did Freemasonry get introduced to the military? Since early on, it seemed like it was more of an aristocratic class that had taken it from operative Masons to speculative Masons. And was it through the officers, or how did it get introduced to the military itself?
Right. So you think about English society in the 18th century, there was complete crossover between the elites and the army itself. So the commissions were purchased by men who could afford them, and they would hand them down to their sons and relatives. And so, yes, that would have been pretty important. And I haven't, maybe people have done this research. I haven't done it myself to sort of look at the military connections of the original founders of the Grand Lodge. But by that point, Masonic lodges were already fairly well spread across England. And so and Scotland, of course, it's not surprising that there would have been crossover in terms of membership of those lodges with people holding commissions in army regiments. But I think that there's no way it would have really taken off in the British Army if it had sort of remained an exclusive officers club. And it becomes for, and you don't see the regular soldiers joining Freemasonry until later on. But non-commissioned officers could join the regimental lodges. And it becomes really a way for soldiers to ease their boredom. So a lot of times they'd be stationed in these remote locations for years and years on end, and to have a Masonic lodge meet on a regular basis could help them with their tour, so to speak, right? Especially if they weren't engaged in one of the many conflicts I've been talking about. And obviously death rates were also extremely high, especially for soldiers who were in the Caribbean in this period. And so, it's also important to know that the British Army of the 18th century was not an all-male affair. They had traveling spouses, and not all of them, but certainly the officers and some of the NCOs, and then men would of course form relationships along the way. And so there were children to be taken care of. And so Freemasonry, while it did have those early associations with elites, quickly becomes, within the context of an army, an institution that's able to serve and appeal to a broader range of men.
Interesting. One other just quick question, if I can, before I open it up to the floor again for another question, is the other institution that was at play in that time, which is the church, both Christian and specifically Catholic. And I know that Church of England was probably the major moral influence on most of the soldiers that were traveling, but was there any issues between either of those churches and the fraternity in its early days?
So the Church of England was the established church of Britain and the British Empire, and the regiments would have had Church of England chaplains assigned to them. Whether or not they actually showed up for duty was another story. The Church of England was obviously important in several of the colonies, but it's also important to remember that the non-official Protestant churches were really important. Maybe not so much among the membership of Freemasonry, but also in knitting together this Atlantic world. So just like the Freemasons, for example, the Methodists had these correspondence networks that would span the Atlantic, and they'd send speakers back and forth across. And so when we think about cultural institutions that were responsible for integrating the Atlantic world, it's important to keep those dissenting Protestant sects in mind as well. But in terms of the other part of your question, and the relationship between Freemasonry and the Catholic Church, by the second half of the 18th century, there's quite a lot of enmity between Freemasonry and the Catholic Church. But that sort of takes a while to take hold. And Irish historians have demonstrated that there were actually more Catholic Freemasons than Protestant Freemasons, which seems crazy these days, right? But in the 18th century, and it's only over time as the Catholic Church becomes more serious about excluding its members from participation in Freemasonry, that you see a shift towards Protestantism in Irish Masonic lodges. And so there's a lot of evidence in the 18th century of Catholics joining the Brotherhood, and even occasionally men from other religions as well. And so one of the issues that I trace in the book is how in the 18th century there is evidence of the fraternal cosmopolitanism really on display, with the admission of men from various backgrounds. But then by the time you get to the 19th century, that tends to recede, and you see a closer association between Freemasonry and, say, just Anglicanism, white men in the colonies especially. And then it takes another movement within Freemasonry in the 1860s and 70s for it to broaden back out again.
I was just curious if you were familiar with Jasper Ridley's History of Freemasonry book.
Yeah.
Yeah, it talks a lot about the political turmoil with certain governments like the Austrian Empire and the Napoleonic era and so forth, and how their view of Freemasonry teeter-totter, was favorable at one time, not favorable at another, and sometimes Freemasons were persecuted. It's a pretty dry read, but to be honest, but it does speak a lot to the political aspects of it, and you know, how the royal family tied themselves in with Freemasonry in the 17th century. It travels all the way up into the 1990s. But it's kind of an interesting read, but it is dry.
Who's the author?
Jasper Ridley.
Jasper Ridley.
Good name.
Yeah, and in the case of the British, it's very clear that there's a concerted effort on the part of the Grand Lodge after it heals the schism in the 1810s to make sure that people know that they are a loyalist institution. So emerging out of the age of revolutions and all of this turmoil. So in fact, the British government really clamps down on fraternities and secret organizations during the 1790s. They require organizations to send lists of members so that they can keep an eye on them. And in this process, the Grand Lodges of England that eventually become the United Grand Lodge in 1813 really try to convince the authorities that they're not rebels. They are there to uphold the established authority. And so you see a very close alignment between the government, the royal family, and the officers of Grand Lodge moving forward from that point.
Some other questions from the floor, Most Worshipful?
You struck me, first of all, Jessica, great job. I really enjoyed your presentation. You said at one time it was 3 guineas for a warrant, which was the equivalent of about 600 pounds.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if my math is not askew, that would be like 785 bucks
Mm-hmm.
or something like that. And it really struck me because that in part is going to be some of what I will present at the end of this in terms of our dues structure and our expenses in the survival of Freemasonry. So it was pretty interesting. I don't know if any mathematicians there, but at least from what I saw, 600 pounds would be approximately $782 or $85.
Yeah, it was a significant amount, and it was, it was one way that they could sort of regulate Freemasonry again, because not everybody could afford to pay that. So that in that way, they ensured that those applying for a warrant were at the appropriate social level.
Which I believe is actually true today as well. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Derek, you have a question?
Yeah, so I love that presentation. What really struck me is seeing that charter come up for the lodge at Falmouth, which if folks don't know, the lodge at Falmouth became Portland Lodge, which is now part of Triangle Lodge, which I'm a member.
Okay.
And we still have that original charter in our safe in the building. And I wish you were in the state. I would love to take you over there and show it off. And I
Agreed.
definitely am going to talk to our secretary, who is our lodge historian, about some of the things you mentioned about the lodge at Falmouth switching between the ancient and modern structure in various times. I hope that he's going to have something in there and some enlightenment
Yeah,
on that.
it'd be fascinating.
Absolutely. And if anybody's interested in high-res scans of that original charter, let me know. I happen to have them on my computer. But thank you again.
Okay, thank you. That's
Thank
great.
you, Derek. Liam, how are you? Welcome to the group, Liam. It's great to see you here.
Hi, Dan. Thanks. Jessica, thanks so much for your talk. It was fascinating and really great to see that careful archival research. I wanted to return to one of the questions that Dan asked about the relationship between the military and the Masonic order. And particularly, I'm interested in the, sort of highest officer class and they're in Britain and their relationship to Masonry in an era when it's sort of expanding beyond elite circles. And I have a particular self-serving reason for asking the question. I was Googling around, working on my own talk later today, and it is very easy to get information about founding fathers who were Masons, right? There's all sorts of websites that comment on this. But when I do the same thing for the British officer class, I find nothing. So now this is a legacy of Google's algorithms and our contemporary situation.
Right.
And so I'm curious in picking your brain about this. The specific case I was looking at was Henry Clinton. Did he have any Masonic connections? And I again, this is superficial work on my part, but I would love to know your sense about him in particular, or just more generally for aristocratic officer culture at the end of the 18th century. Were they not so interested in Masonry as it expanded its reach to a broader, more middling class?
No, I think they still would have been, because it's right at this time that the organization is really solidifying its relationship with the royal family. And so as long as the royal family continue to be, and many of them are Grand Masters, they're not doing the everyday work of Masonic administration, but they hold the office of Grand Master. And as long as the royal family are supporting the organization, as many aristocrats as possible are going to want to be affiliated. Clinton in particular, I don't know. I would definitely refer you to Steve Bullock, and also you can actually contact the Grand Lodge in England, and they will look up, and they have files. Not I don't think much of this has been digitized yet, but they can look up, and if lodges in the area, they can check the returns that were sent back. And also they have files for individuals, that because they are constantly getting inquiries. It's probably their most common inquiry: was so and so a Freemason, right? So yeah. So now that doesn't. I'm not saying therefore that they cherish the idea of socializing with their social people of a lower social status. And a lot of the lodges, and again, this relates to the point about fees and dues, would have within themselves practice a lot of exclusivity. And so you would have lodges of certain occupational groups, or you would have lodges that the fees were so high that only the wealthiest could afford to join that particular lodge. And I think the history of Freemasonry is, and Steve talks about this in his book as well, is really the story of this constant tension between its inclusive ideology and sort of cosmopolitan promise on the one hand, and more exclusive sort of approaches to particular lodges or to Freemasonry as a whole in particular moments in time.
It's interesting. I mean, and even then they talk about how Freemasonry was taking two groups that had never had anything to do with each other and at least created somewhat of a middle ground or an opportunity somewhere in between those two groups.
Yeah, it says in the charges that the idea is to bring together men who would have otherwise been at a perpetual distance. And that's really important coming out of the turmoil of the 17th century, the period when the British Isles was sort of descended into these awful wars, the English Civil War, which was actually the War of the Three Kingdoms, the religious warfare that was raging between Protestants and Catholics across Europe. Masonry emerges out of that as a way for men who would otherwise have seen each other as enemies and not been able to talk to each other, let alone socialize, to come together and at least for a while in the lodge setting and be brothers. And of course, this is why there's the rule against talking about religion and politics very explicitly. That's always really, to me, been one of the most fascinating aspects of Freemasonry's history. And what I wanted to do was see how this ideal that emerges out of the Enlightenment and that has a promise of cosmopolitanism, how that played out in the context of empire, where power relations are always and fundamentally unequal, and where as the empire grows, it increases in its diversity, and thus there's more pressure on Freemasonry to realize its initial promise.
Yeah, that rule is always interesting. I think in a large part, it was a very smart rule about the politics and religion, because it's been said both of those are very personal choices in a lot of ways. So you don't necessarily always make friends, you know, it's an internal choice.
Yeah.
Another question from the floor. Anybody have a question? I have one more. Feel free to jump in, but I wanted to ask this question, which was getting in the certificates. Now, you know, in modern day lodges, there's a series of exam questions, other ways that a member can be, you know, welcomed into a lodge. And that's, of course, if nobody personally knows the member. If someone can vouch, then that's fine. But we do have other ways that brothers recognize brothers. As you showed in one of your illustrations, even early on, some of that information was leaked. Some of it was made public. You saw, you know, one of the handshakes in one of the illustrations you put out. Were people able to really differentiate, or were those imposters that predominant that they would actually get into lodges using this kind of semi-public information?
Yeah, and that goes back to your earlier point about the public nature of Freemasonry in the 18th and 19th century. Really, there was very little that was secret about Freemasonry in the 18th century, because almost from the beginning, exposés were being published and people could find out what was going on. And so, yes, I mean, I don't think the moderns would have issued a circular, printed it out and sent it to all of its lodges within Britain and out to the colonies if this hadn't been a real problem. And so you know, these are the days before insurance. So where are you going to go if you, and even most of the friendly societies that would emerge in British and American history aren't, you know, that's not going to come until the 19th century. So where are you going to go when you fall on hard times? And Freemasonry was really the first network to, you know, aside from relying on the church and your community, that, you know, this was a way that people could get through it. And what is, you know, what I find really interesting was that the safety net really reaches out into the empire and helps people that are traveling, that are encountering even more. You know, now, there aren't many hurricanes in the British Isles, but as soon as you get over here, you know, hurricanes become a thing. And so yes, I think people were aware of what being a member could bring, and they tried to infiltrate it to the extent that it really did become a problem. And the reason, going back to your original point in this question, they were able to do this was because, going back to this, even the 1750s, there were already these exposés about the inner workings of the Masonic Lodge.
We'll talk about the book you're working on in just a second. But I did have one last question, if I may. You talk about the treatment of POWs as being possibly an incentive at the time to join Freemasonry. I've read books from with the perspective of non-Freemasons, seeing this play out in front of them. A POW getting special treatment, or do you think that continued to act as an incentive to join, or did that actually create some disdain among non-Masons who were seeing other soldiers, POWs, getting preferential treatment?
I mean, it must have, but all I can say is what I've seen in the archival record, and I, in 18th century records, you're not going to be able to see that kind of dynamic playing, like how people reacted to the fact that when a POW indicated to his captors that he was a Mason, if he somehow got better treatment or was saved from punishment, that how the others reacted around that. I mean, one place that this may have happened was in French lodges during the period of the Revolution, when there were so many tensions within French society, again, like as there were in the British world, between the revolutionaries and more conservative members of lodges. Maybe that would have, but they would have been at odds anyway. Are the examples that you're referring to from later on, from like 20th century sources, or?
No, Civil War is
Civil
when I was
War.
reading those. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
All right. Well, I'll open it up for any last questions before we discuss the book. Would anybody have? Please go right ahead.
You had mentioned how the breach from the Revolution was healed pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously England and France have a long storied history of conflict. And you look at, French Canada, and then the Maritimes, and then the United States, and you really kind of have this blend of these three countries. Do you feel that the role of Masonry might have been a catalyst, not the only catalyst, but maybe a catalyst of how quickly that breach was healed? Because I'm assuming the provincial Grand Master, after or during even the Revolutionary War, probably wasn't overseeing the Lodge of Boston and these other places.
Yeah.
So do you think Masonry might have played a role as a catalyst in healing that breach as quickly as it was healed?
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. Again, this is something that Steve talks about in the book. There's a movement to establish a national Grand Lodge within the United States in the 1780s. It doesn't work out, in part because all of the individual colonies that had become states had their own Masonic Grand Lodge structures, and they were very closely connected with the lodges, the Grand Lodges back in the British Isles, as we've seen.
Right.
And I think that they wanted to maintain their descent and their affiliation with the Mother Grand Lodge back in England, even after the war. That said, I don't think we can underestimate the role of trade and commerce and these other factors in particularly healing the breach after the American Revolution.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, we'll take a short break in a second, but before you go, Jessica, can you tell us the title of the book? There was a question, the title of the book that you're working in conjunction with, a little bit about that, please.
Okay, so the title of the book is called The Fraternal Atlantic. It's coming out with Routledge Press, ROUTLEDGE, which is a premier academic press based in Britain. And It has articles by Bonnie Huskins, who or chapters, I should say, by Bonnie Huskins and a collection of other scholars. One looks at the role of Freemasonry among refugees from the Haitian Revolution. So French refugees from the Haitian Revolution who end up in places like New Orleans. There are some chapters on Freemasonry among the German communities that are taking root in New York and other parts of the Northeast during the 19th and 20th centuries. And so I can send a link to that at some point. And if you're affiliated at all with academic libraries, you can actually get several of these articles through a journal called Atlantic Studies. So it started out as a special issue of this journal, Atlantic Studies, and is now being transformed into an edited volume.
That's great. Thank you very much. We appreciate this so much, Jessica. Thank you for your speech. It was fantastic.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Thanks. So everybody, I would suggest here we take a short break, just allowing everybody to, get a second cup of coffee or whatever. Liam will be starting at 9:45, correct, Liam? All right, fantastic. So we'll reconvene here at 9:45, and I will see you all then. I'm going to resume the recording now and welcome everybody back again. Liam, thank you so much for spending time today speaking with us. This is great. I did want to have one shout out here, and that's to George McDougall. And George, what a great job you did putting stuff together, the schedule, and working with our guest speakers. So a big thank you to George McDougall for that. With that, I would like to hand the floor over to Liam.
Great. Thanks, Dan.
Would you like to do screen sharing, Liam? Should I make you a co-host?
Yeah, if you can enable it, that would be great.
Absolutely.
So let's just get my dun, dun, dun. All right, I think I've got that shared appropriately.
Looks great.
And I think if people opt for the gallery view, they should be able to see both the PowerPoint and also some of our small faces, which as we all do more and more Zoom events and Zoom teaching, in my case, I find it pretty deadening to always be looking at my computer screen. And I am appreciative of those of you who have your screens or your cameras turned on, since looking out at all of my students' names and black screens gets pretty challenging. So it's really a pleasure to be invited to speak with the Maine Masonic College Convocation again this year. My topic is going to be the sort of situation of the northeastern borderlands in British colonial America on the eve of the American Revolution. So trying to look back on the other side of this momentous political development that has shaped so much of US national culture in particular, and recovering that world, and particularly the politics of that world, can be very difficult because we're so shaped by our sense of the US nation and the sort of political values that we have now as seen through a sort of patriot lens of the American Revolution, that understanding the patriots' deep British roots is often pretty challenging and something of a shock. And this is something that surprises my students a great deal at the University of Maine when I teach courses about the American Revolution. But the place where I was teaching, where this was the biggest shock of all to my students, was when I taught at the University of Glasgow in the spring of 2012. And when I was talking about the origins of the revolution as really driven by British political ideals, my Scottish students just couldn't believe it. They were so taken aback. So I do think it's really a challenge for us to recover that world. And I look forward to talking about it a bit with all of you. Before I do plunge into my topic, though, I want to, as I do whenever I meet with the Maine Masons, say how much I appreciate the support of the Maine Masonic College in particular for Maine National History Day. Many of you are familiar with this and have served as judges, Walter, George, and Don in particular. I see you on our screens today. But this has been a really great partnership between the University of Maine and the Masonic College. It's a middle school and high school history program. It's sort of like a science fair for history. And what makes the event so fantastic is that students do their own original research that has to connect to a theme that's established by the national organization every year. And then every single student project gets reviewed by a group of judges, and we have a conversation with those students about their research. And to connect with middle school students in particular who have a unalloyed passion for history and who often do just wonderful original historical research is an absolute treat. And the Maine Masonic College has provided financial support for at least 6 years, maybe longer than that now, and also regularly provides a fleet of judges to help us carry out this program. So the contest theme for 2021 is communication in history, the key to understanding. That seems to me like a very Masonic sort of theme. And every student's research project, which can be on any subject in any aspect of history that they're passionate about, but how they're evaluated is how does their research help us to understand that theme better? Communication in history, the key to understanding. So this year, the statewide contest will be on May 1st, 2021. I think it's almost certainly to be a Zoom event, as it was in 2020 as well. And one of the things that we discovered is that Zoom actually has facilitated Maine National History Day, and our numbers have grown dramatically as a result. You know, people don't have to get all the way to Orono by 8:30 a.m. to have the judges' breakfast and orientation. We can do that via Zoom from the comfort of our own home. And so our numbers have really grown dramatically. So it's a plea to those of you who might have a passion for history, who want to connect with young people who also love history. We really would love to have you join as judges again, or to join as judges for the first time in 2021. And it doesn't require any special training. We will put new judges with veteran judges, and it's really engaging these young students in conversations about their historical research. And in addition to the state contest on May 1st, we've now grown so that we have regional contests before the state contest. So yet more need for judges to help with those regional contests. And one will be hosted in Lewiston and the other in Bangor. But again, these are all Zoom events. So we really appreciate the Maine Masonic College's commitment in the past, and look forward to this fruitful relationship going forward into the future. I don't know, does anybody, George, Walter, Don, anyone want to make a plug for National History Day? Tell your brothers what a great event it is and why they should get involved.
I will, even though my mouth is full here, but it is well, the live one is an awesome day. It's a lot of work. It goes really fast, but you won't believe how much you learn from these kids and how much work they've already done to come and present it to you. So I missed the one this spring that was virtual, but I'm looking forward to May 1st to do that again. So yeah, approach somebody on the board, because like Liam said, you don't need to be a history professor to do it. They even take engineers, so it works out really well.
I'd make a comment from this is DK Horn. I'd make a comment from a different perspective. Both of my sons competed. Both of them went to the national level competition. The younger one, the older one joined a little bit late, did it his senior year and kind of wished he'd done it sooner. My younger son competed 3 times, going to nationals 3 times. The last time he competed at the regionals and then went on to the States. And it really was a memorable event for them. They got a lot out of it. And I was astounded at the, you know, my younger one did one on something that I related to, you know, about submarines and production of submarines. But then he went on and did one about the founder of modern Turkey. And his last one was on the lost Greek tragedies, which I wasn't quite sure I understood his topic. But it's just fascinating opportunity for the kids because, like you said, there's a topic. But if you think about it, the kids can turn that selected topic into absolutely anything, and they certainly do. And if you ever get a chance to go down to the national competition, walking through the display topics or being able to sit in on some of the presentations is absolutely fantastic. It's an amazing event. So I strongly support it. Thank you for all you do on it.
I would strongly support what George said. It is so much fun talking to those students during that event. And I'm hoping to be able to participate again this spring. Thank you.
All right. Well, let me turn to my topic, politics and the diversity of the British colonial world. Again, before the American Revolution, right? That's gonna change things and distort things. And the challenge for us today is, can we try to cast ourselves back into a world before the patriot movement sunders the British Empire and leads to the kind of national history that we're quite familiar with. So just like Jessica spoke earlier about the importance of the Atlantic world and maritime connections that really shaped people's understanding of the world of the 18th century, I'm going to be taking up and picking up on a lot of those themes again. And in particular, it's the sort of Anglo-American connections that are so important to understand the political world of the colonies on the eve of the American Revolution. Now, a study of politics has really bedeviled the field of colonial American history for a variety of reasons. And one of the chief among them is that for a long, long time, the only real reason to study politics in the colonial period was in order to explain the coming of the revolution. Right? So this had a distorting effect for historians studying the 18th century and even the 17th century, you know, kind of this constant need, you know, particularly for American colonial historians, to explain what were the seeds, what were the origins of the American Revolution. And that actually made colonial American history sort of a marginal field among US historians, right? If the only thing that was really important about the colonial period was to explain how it led into the American Revolution, it didn't really make work in the pre-revolutionary period very notable or significant. And this changed dramatically in the 1970s and 1980s, when a new generation of historians inspired by a non-political approach to history began to ask new questions and look at new kinds of evidence in order to explain what was colonial America like. And so the sort of way I synthesize that generation of social history work about colonial America is, I think, helped by this map of regional groupings of colonies. And the social historians, you know, when you looked at the political development of each colony, every single colony required a separate history. They had very distinct political cultures, legal foundations, organizations of how politics was done in those colonies. And those colonies did not really communicate with one another, right? It was a very back to the metropolitan center sort of connection, right? They didn't really care what was going on to a colony to the north or the south of them. All that really mattered was their relationship with the center of the empire. So these social historians who began to do their work in the 1970s and 1980s said, well, what if we don't obsess ourselves so much with politics and look at other kinds of aspects of early American society? What can we see as broader patterns and themes of significance? And they developed a regional understanding of early American history that grouped together colonies with very important similarities that were largely connected to human demography and economics. So there were similar migration patterns, similar types of crops raised, and these had all sorts of interesting consequences for the institutions that developed in each of these regions. So kind of to briefly recap the distinctions between these four, and I'll kind of take them in chronological order as they are founded over time. You know, English colonial history in mainland North America begins in Virginia with Jamestown in 1607. And that Chesapeake region, which I see here in green, was really shaped by a commitment to growing tobacco. And from very early on in that colonial development, that was really the driving raison d'etre for the Chesapeake colonies. So initially, tobacco is grown by indentured servants, and that was quite an innovation in early 17th century Virginia and Maryland. And by the end of the 17th century, that indentured labor population becomes almost entirely an enslaved population. So tobacco agriculture predates slavery as a widespread institution in the Chesapeake, but by the start of the 18th century, tobacco and slave labor have come together to really define the Chesapeake region in really profound ways. Now, if we look north to New England, we have a completely different circumstance, right? We have no major cash crop that can really be grown around the Atlantic world. We've also got a very distinctive migration stream to New England that is very, very different than the kind of Englishmen that went to Virginia and the Chesapeake in the 17th century. So we've got a much more religious orientation, and we've got a migration that's not being done overwhelmingly by poor young English boys. Those are the people who become indentured servants. Instead, we've got this family migration to New England. And that family migration is very intensive early in the 1630s, but it's not really sustained by much new migration for a variety of reasons, but in particular, because New England is not a great place for economic opportunity for a new settler in the 17th or 18th century, right? It just has a limited agricultural climate. So given the option, later migrants will tend to go to other places. But because that initial New England migration was by families, the population in the region increases very quickly, even without the kind of major sustained immigration that we get to other regions of colonial British America. Now, to fill out the map from those 17th century pioneers of English North America, we've got the development of the middle colonies with the kind of bipolar centers of New York and Pennsylvania. And again, this region is quite distinct from the other two. Here, the major cash crop is wheat. And the kinds of people who are coming to settle New York and Pennsylvania are much more ethnically and religiously diverse than the migrants that we had seen to either of the earlier 17th century English regions. So we've got Dutch and Swedish and Finnish colonies that predate the English mobilization to the middle colonies. Then, of course, we've got Quakers being a dominant political presence in the colony of Pennsylvania. Of course, we've got major German immigration by the middle of the 18th century. So again, the distinctiveness of the middle colonies or the mid-Atlantic compared to the Chesapeake or New England are quite striking. And then the slowest mainland region to develop are the colonies of the lower South that I would even call the low country, because most of the 18th century settlement here is very much clustered on the coast in sort of the greater Charleston area, parts of coastal North Carolina, and also parts of coastal Georgia. And the great distinction of agriculture in South Carolina and Georgia in particular is the development of rice as a major crop. And here, unlike the Chesapeake, the development of a major cash crop for export is immediately done with slave labor. And in fact, by 1705, the colony of South Carolina has a majority population that is enslaved. That's a pretty amazing fact, I think, right? In our imagination, we often think of colonial America as symbolized by a Puritan. But a Puritan is one of the most unusual people to live in 18th century colonial America. And in fact, in a place like South Carolina, the average person in colonial society would have been of quite possibly African birth, but certainly of African descent by the first decades of the 18th century. So, you know, if the American Revolution has one kind of distorting effect on how we think about early American history, we also have the challenge of the Civil War with its own distorting impact as well. And we could say that we can begin to see a difference between North and South that we will see intensify in the early national period and of course explode in the terrible conflict of the Civil War in the 1860s in this regional map that I've shared with you. Slavery is a legal institution everywhere in British colonial America at this time, but New England and the middle colonies are societies with slavery. Right? Slavery is legal, and there are people of African descent, almost all of whom are enslaved in New England and the mid-Atlantic. But these are part of colonial societies that in ways that are quite different from what we see in the Chesapeake and the lower South. And those two regions we would describe as slave societies. Societies where slavery is so crucial not just to the economy, but to everyday human interactions, to cultural organizations, social institutions, political institutions, that the presence of slavery infuses and defines almost all aspects of society in the Chesapeake and the Low Country. Now, so that is sort of my 5-minute recap of how have social historians encouraged us to think about colonial history differently. And as important as that work has been, and as interesting as I think it is to understand these regional developments, there is also at least one aspect of this map that we have been looking at and discussing that is really problematic and misleading. And so this is a way of thinking about the colonial era that does so also through the constricted lens of US national history. Because in 1770, on the eve of the American Revolution, there were at least 26 British colonies in the Atlantic world, right? We tend to think that almost all the colonies were the 13 colonies and that almost all of them decided to separate from the British Empire. But again, that's just the way that Americans have thought about early American history and the colonial world in particular. So it's sort of interesting that the two professors you have here with you today come from state institutions in Maine and Florida, because people who work in Maine and Florida have a somewhat bristling sense of British colonial America as just those 13 colonies. So absolutely crucial to the British colonial world is the British West Indies, right? This is really where the action is. And the British colonies in the West Indies begin with Barbados, a tiny little island in the Lesser Antilles here. And by the 18th century, Jamaica has really emerged as the crucial British colony in the Caribbean. Now here we again have colonies that are slave societies, and here they are producing the incredibly high demand, high value crop of sugar, right? This was the microchip or supercomputer of the early American world. If you could get in on sugar, this is what you grew. So we might like to think that Puritans were pious and had better values, and that's why they didn't commit themselves to slavery in a wholehearted way. But sadly, that is not true. If they could have grown sugar in New England, they would have. And we do have some Puritan settlements in the Caribbean who attempt to become sugar plantation masters on the scale of other successful English colonists in the Caribbean as well. Now, from a Maine point of view, I am interested in this northeastern borderlands and how we might understand Maine history differently from the perspective of our geographic location. So this is really a favorite map of mine. I think it was produced in 1772. It's called A New Map of Nova Scotia and Cape Breton Island with the adjacent parts of New England and Canada. And what I think is so illuminating about this map is that it helps us to take a step back in time and to try to reimagine Maine as situated in a context where it is not part of the United States, right? Our imagination of Maine cartographically, I think, is often as the head of this weird national map of the US, right? Florida is a funny leg, Texas is a funny leg, Maine is up there as the head of this US national animal. Well, you know, that is not how people in the 18th century thought of their world, right? It's impossible that they did. So I really like here in this map, we've got Maine. Let me see, where can I find, maybe this is MDI. So Maine is here, and it's in the middle of this landmass, and it is really on the fault line of empire, right? When the American Revolution succeeds, Quebec and Nova Scotia are going to remain within the empire. Neither Quebec or Nova Scotia had any significant mobilization of the colonial population that was interested in separating, right? And Massachusetts, of course, and other parts of northern New England are going to join the revolutionary movement. But Maine's position on the revolutionary struggle is really quite ambiguous and ambivalent, right? We might, if we are 21st century patriots, hope that we would look to Maine history of the late 18th century and have all sorts of examples of bold patriot leadership. And there is some of that, but not as much as we might think. And for most residents, English colonial residents of Maine, they were wary and uncertain and a little suspicious of those hotheads from Massachusetts and the kinds of trouble they were getting into. And for the most part, they were hoping to wait out the Revolutionary War, see what transpired, protect their families and themselves in order to weather a time of real hostility, political and military conflict, and the potential for real risk to oneself. So again, my goal is to try to help us think a little bit more about the world of the northeastern borderlands and the world of New England prior to this incredible rupture of the American Revolution. So I want to do so by looking at some modern maps that were made by my colleague, Stephen Hornsby, who's a 18th century historical geographer, published a terrific book, British Atlantic American Frontier, that's sort of a overview of 17th and 18th century British Atlantic history. And he took all of the maps in the book and has colorized them and put them online where they can be downloaded for free. So if you're curious and digging around at more of Stephen's work, you can go to his personal webpage on the Canadian American Center's website at the University of Maine. And I've plucked out some of these to take a look at and talk a bit about. And I think it would be great to have questions, interspersed. It's sort of fun to look together at these images and talk about what they reveal to us. So don't hesitate to unmute and put your hand up or ask a question. And I'll just make one comment about this map and then see if anyone has a question or comment. And what I think that this is giving us a sense of New England's economic connections around the British Atlantic world, again, on the very eve of the American Revolution. We've got a really distinct data set. Some great evidence was collected about the transport of certain commodities around the British Atlantic world only for this short window of years, 1768 to 1772. So you'll often see historians focus on this period because that's where our best evidence is. And obviously what this map shows us overwhelmingly is New England's integration into a British Atlantic world, but more particularly its important connection with the West Indies, right? And that's just a reminder of how powerfully sugar was the driver of 18th century commerce and the British Empire of the 18th century. So love to take a
Liam,
question.
can I ask a quick question on this one? This is interesting.
Thanks. Liam.
So when I'm looking at this, obviously the economy is very tied in with the West Indies, as you said. Out of curiosity, what was the destination of goods going to Africa? Who was receiving them there?
So the 18th century is, we would like to think of it as the age of enlightenment, and that certainly connects with the flourishing of Masonry in the 18th century and that sense of universal brotherhood. But the 18th century is also the age of slavery. And the explosion of the transatlantic slave trade in the 18th century, particularly fueled by sugar plantation slavery in the Caribbean and on the coast of Brazil, and then only at a very secondary or tertiary level with tobacco and rice in North America, is really the crucial driver here. So we have New Englanders involved in this trade, both essentially, for the most part, sending food and wood products to those slave plantations in the Caribbean. They don't want to waste their valuable sugar crop growing land raising food. They would rather import food from around the Atlantic world. So the dried fish, the livestock, goes from New England to support the slave economies in the West Indies. And then you do have New England merchants and New England ships that are involved in the slave trade. And the suggestion here is that rum, a byproduct of the sugar industry from the Caribbean, is often processed in New England. And then that's part of what is exchanged on the coast of Africa to purchase more enslaved people to come back again, right? As a merchant, you're constantly interested in what can I have in my ship, both going west and going east, so that I'm constantly profiting as I'm moving around this interconnected Atlantic world.
Liam, this is Luke. Question, if I were to, is there a unit of time on those British pounds? Is that per year, or is that total between 1768 and 1772?
I think that that is for the full 5-year period.
And then follow-up question to that, if we were to see a second step, like this is for New England exports and the economic amount that they exported, if you did the same for the West Indies, it would be intriguing to see, out of that $278,000 spent in the West Indies, what was the amount that made it back to the British Isles? Because that 278 is kind of an investment in the sugar, the enslaved sugar trade. And then what does that amount look like on that return on investment? Do you know if there's a historian who has that data? Is that something that Stephen
you can go right to Stephen's book or to his website. He's got, sort of chapter by chapter looks at different regions. And the overall argument of his book, which we see in his title, British Atlantic American Frontier, is that the British imperial approach is very much a maritime one, whereas the American frontier is a land-based continental empire. So he is sort of setting up here the schism to come with the American Revolution. But he, as a historical geographer, is interested in explaining it in terms of geographic, economic, and social factors, not so much political ones. Okay. So his argument is that the 13 mainland colonies have a sort of different orientation to their economies that are going to lead to the sort of 19th century rise of the US.
Final question. Does he also have a graphic in there of the imports? Like, this is stuff going out. Does he have a graphic or a map of things coming in?
Yeah, he does. And I think this is not quite the same as what you said, but I'm going to go on to two other maps of his that I think will help us to think a little bit more about this. So here are two more maps helping us think about what is New England's place in the British Atlantic world of the 18th century. And part of what Stephen does as such a clever historical geographer is he gives us a different looking map, right? We don't have north to the top, as is our traditional orientation. And by reorienting the map, I think it helps us to see the New England coast and the position of New England in the North Atlantic from a really helpful altered perspective. So on the left, we've got a sense of the fisheries off the New England coast. And this, of course, has been the economic backbone of European connections to the North Atlantic and to the western side of the Atlantic, dating back 2 centuries before English settlement begins. We found relatively recently, a historian has uncovered insurance records of Basque fishing operations that date to the early 16th century that document transatlantic fishing in the St. Lawrence Riverway and on the coast of Maine that really has pushed back our sense of how early and long this period of contact was. So gives us a different sense of the priorities on the left, thinking about the fisheries and the early contact that was really capital intensive and was the primary connection for New England's place in the English Atlantic world of the 17th century. You know, again, we think a lot about those Puritans in the 1630s and how they begin a certain American national tradition. But I would, again, emphasize that they're really the oddities and that seasonal fisheries were really earlier and longer and more significant for the place of the northeastern borderlands in the British Empire of the 17th and 18th century. Of course, along with fish, the fur trade is the other, that's really the most lucrative crop of North America, right? Sugar could not grow there. It's limited to tropical and semi-tropical regions. But the European demand for fur was incredible. I mean, and just think about this, where still the colonial period coincides with the Little Ice Age. And this was an era of incredibly cold temperatures, no Gore-Tex available, and the value of furs was really beyond measure. And much of Europe has been deforested and overtrapped by the late medieval period. So, and overfished for that matter. So they're coming to get fish, which you really can't get in the inshore fisheries off of Europe by the late medieval period. And what we particularly see in this map from 1770 is that the fur trade has already moved beyond the coast by the end of the 18th century, right? The overtrapping and the exploitation of this new larger market meant that you had to penetrate the interior of the continent to get abundant and high quality fur. So now some of it is of course still coming to the coast through Native American trade networks, but the Hudson Bay Company, the St. Lawrence River, the way that connects to the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River, by the late 18th century, that's really where the action is in terms of the economy of the British Atlantic world. Anybody have a question about these funny sideways maps?
I like them. I like the way they set them up.
Yeah. So I think as Dan mentioned earlier, it is hard for us to recapture just how crucial water transportation was to the 18th century. You know, it was just so expensive to move anything by land, and roads were so expensive to build. So it's really all about water as the superhighways of the era. And I just think the fishery and fur trade maps really give us a sense of what water transportation meant for the world of the 18th century. And I dare say this is even more significant in the northeastern borderlands, which is so lightly settled by European speaking people. There's, I mean, well into the 19th century, you really can't get many places in Maine by road, right? It's coastal settlement, it's movement up rivers. That's really where certainly European speaking people lived and how they stayed in touch and connected with others.
Liam.
Yeah.
How big was the timber trade at that time coming out of Maine? Everyone was on the water. They must have been on timbers.
Absolutely. It's just crucial. And again, the deforestation of much of Europe just made access to timber essential. And, you know, huge areas in the Northeast have been designated as the King's Woods and timber that will be exclusively used for the British Navy. So this is and this is part of why English speaking settlers in Maine at the time of the Revolution were very hesitant about what the rebels in southern New England were talking about, because their livelihood was connected to the water, was connected to trade, was connected to British naval commitment to the fantastic timber of the Northeast. So absolutely.
Just a quick follow-up. How long did it take to deplete the timbers in Maine? Any idea?
Well, I mean, that's really the history of 19th century Maine, and it's the heyday of Maine population growth and economic expansion. So the age of sail and the boom time of the Maine economy just goes by leaps and bounds every decade of the 19th century. Until we get to the Civil War, there's actually a big disruption. And the 1870 census is the first time that we've got a decrease in the overall population of Maine. And partly that represents deaths in the Civil War itself, but I think even more importantly, it represented young Maine men moving out of state to fight in the war and realizing there was more economic opportunity elsewhere. I think the timber industry continues in Maine, up to the present, obviously, but continues going gangbusters really until the next big setback in the Depression. And I think the Maine timber economy, has continued since then, but not as such a vital and dominant industry as it was through the 1920s, at least.
Liam, can I ask a quick question too? Since
that would be, I would think that shipbuilding would be a big part of things right now.
I'm sorry, I talked over you. Could you repeat that?
That's okay. I would think that during this same time, the 1700s and whatever, is shipbuilding would have been a big part of area too.
Absolutely. But I'll get to this in just a second, but basically Maine, the shipbuilding is very important in New England, but Maine is so lightly settled in the 18th century that it's boom time for shipbuilding is yet to come. That will really be the first decades of, really all through the 19th century, right? That's when we really see Maine coming into its own as a economic powerhouse.
Liam, can I ask you a quick question since we're at this time period right now? We're in basically 17th century into 18th century. What was the influence of Southern colonies at this time, particularly the Spanish coming up from the South? And my question there really is, what resources were they dealing in? And, I'm assuming here that once we talk about New England and the English influence, we're talking again about Freemasonry at that time spreading, particularly with the wars. But I'm assuming the Spanish coming up from the South were dealing with different industries and probably had no Masonic background whatsoever coming from the Spanish or Latin countries.
Well, so that's a great question and a fascinating one. The Spanish colonial world is incredibly more impressive than the British colonial world. It is earlier, it is older, it is more durable, and it's more wealthy. And a really crucial part of that is that Spanish colonization took advantage of and exploited pre-existing Native American civilizations extremely effectively. And they did so not by accident or good luck. They did so by very careful strategic thinking. So, Columbus stumbles on what he thinks is the East Indies, and they begin with island settlements in the Caribbean that is going to become this incredible cockpit of European competition and sugar production. But the Spanish hear reports of wealthier and more impressive Native American societies in what is the Mexican highlands, and they go there and succeed in the conquest of the Aztec or Mexica Empire. And then they do similarly. They hear news of this incredible empire in the Andes, thousands of miles, extremely difficult to get to. And those two places, modern day Mexico, modern day Peru, become the great terrestrial centers of this durable Spanish empire that's going to last. It's going to begin at least as early as the 1520s in Mexico and New Spain. And it's going to continue into the 1820s in the case of most of Spanish mainland America. And that Spanish colonial empire is going to last in Cuba to the 1890s. I mean, this is just so much more impressive in terms of geography, in terms of chronology. And then in addition to sugar in the Caribbean, what really makes Spain rich beyond belief are access to precious metal. And the silver mines of northern Mexico, the incredible silver mine of Potosi, this transforms the European economy. It leads to crazy inflation and all kinds of unanticipated consequences for Europe. And this is what every other European nation hoped to do, to replicate. So, and of course do not, so we get these very different histories. Jessica, you got to have a take on that. You could correct me or add something interesting.
I'm just nodding in agreement with everything that you're saying. The British, the English were the new kids on the block. They were pipsqueaks. The Spaniards kept trying to sweep them away. But yeah, and the Anglo-French conflict tends to dominate 18th century narratives, but the Spanish were right there in the thick of it. And as you point out, it's not until the 1820s in most parts of the hemisphere that their presence is even challenged.
Jessica, what about the other part of Dan's question, Freemasonry within Spanish colonial society?
Yeah, so it's not built into the founding of their colonies, obviously, because that predates the history of institutionalized Freemasonry. But there are Freemasons among Spanish and Spanish colonial elites in the mid 18th and certainly the later 18th century, and among the revolutionaries who challenged Spanish imperial dominance. And in terms of looking at the map of the northern eastern seaboard, I think that the Spanish really factor in terms of the founding of the colony of Georgia and sorry. It's Saturday morning, so the dogs are barking at all the walkers. I can come back to that in a little while.
All right. So I think I have just 3 more images to share, but I'm going to bring us to land at long last, even though the water side is really important. And I want to talk a bit more about the northeastern borderlands, but from a non-New England or a non-Massachusetts point of view now. And I think here is a really useful map to remind us of what's going on in the northeastern borderlands. In this case, not on the eve of the American Revolution, but on the eve of the other, even larger 18th century imperial war. So Nova Scotia has become a British territory in the early 18th century. But it's a curious British territory because it is mostly settled by French speakers. So we have very few English speakers in English Nova Scotia through the 1750s. And it abuts what is still French Acadia. So in this map, the blue are French territories and the pink is the British territory. And the richest area of settlement, as is suggested by the dots of these maps, are around the Bay of Fundy, but particularly around this area. This is area that has been reclaimed from the Bay of Fundy and created into incredibly rich agricultural lands by Acadian settlers. So the Acadian settlers have arrived in the early 17th century. They did not have a long sustained immigration pattern, so they tend to be early families who have come, and not only families, but also a heavily single male immigration stream. So they're actually marrying into local Micmac or Mi'kmaq communities. So by the middle of the 18th century, we've got this sort of mixed French-speaking Acadian population in a very lightly settled English colony of Nova Scotia. Now, this is really to set up one of the horrors of the 18th century, which is the Acadian deportation that begins in 1755. So as part of the global 7 Years' War, that is principally known in the US as the French and Indian War, the colonial forces plan and implement a forced deportation of about 2/3 of the French-speaking population of Nova Scotia. And that is a systematic effort that it's particularly intensive in 1755 and 1758, but there will be an expulsion of French speakers from this region as late as 1778, so sort of connecting the 7 Years' War and the American Revolution in interesting ways. Any question or comment? And otherwise, I'll just move on and leave that one there for a bit. All right, well, let's take one other look to remind ourselves of where Maine is at this point in time. And this is really to focus on settlement in New England, again, on the eve of or prior to the American Revolution. So here we have the Kennebec River here, the Penobscot River here. Each of the dots represents settlements of about 200 people. And so I think this really underscores for us how different English-speaking Maine was in the mid and late 18th century from the rest of New England, right? Southern New England, first settled by English speakers in the 1620s, has become a dense colonial region. But when we move to the Northeast, and particularly when we move east to the Kennebec River, the settlements are very light and sparse. So this again, to me, reinforces that sense for English-speaking settlers in Maine during the American Revolution. They felt very much apart from New Englanders to the south, and they were more connected by the ocean to Boston and other port cities, but also to Britain itself. And so the American Revolution for settlers in Maine, again, particularly for those east of the Kennebec, was very much a wait and see situation, and not something that most of them wanted to jump into with 2 feet and commit themselves to something that they weren't necessarily sure was a good idea, and that probably didn't seem to them as much of a homegrown idea either. So I'm going to end with, all I've done is shown maps and space, and I thought I would end with at least showing some faces and talking about these individuals very briefly. And all of them are, with the possible exception of Sir Henry Clinton, I couldn't confirm this, all of these men are Masons. All of them are powerful leaders, significant leaders in the late 18th century world. And all of them make a significant mark in the American Revolution, but each had a deeply British, Anglo-American orientation prior to the revolution. So we need not only think about them in a US national context. And I think, so I'm going to start at the top left. This is a portrait that Benjamin Franklin had made of himself in the 1740s. And it is really celebrating his entry into colonial society as a gentleman. He had this painted after he retired from being a printer. And part of that is signified by this lavish lace cuffs that he has on his shirt, right? This is a conspicuous display of his wealth. This is him saying, I am not an artisan, right? Nobody working a press actually would wear clothing like this. It would get dirty, get destroyed, get caught in the printing press. And one of the things I want to say about Franklin is that Franklin was a very late patriot. His political leadership in the 1760s, he is attempting to make Pennsylvania a royal colony. So at the same time that we think of the 1760s as the start of the American Revolution, of course, Franklin is this, he's the smartest man in the colonies. He is the one international celebrity in the colonial world. Yet he has no interest in the rebellion that has begun to emerge in the mid-1760s. His political enemies are the proprietary Penn family in Pennsylvania, and he is hoping to undercut them by taking away their proprietary privileges and instead make Pennsylvania into a proper royal colony, right? That's wealth, that's sophistication, and that is also the modern future. The proprietors, that's a weird feudal legacy. What Franklin wants is a more modern representational constitutional government that doesn't give the proprietary family those privileges. In the Anglo-American world of the 18th century, let's remember, Parliament and the constitutional monarchy of Great Britain is the most progressive political experiment of 18th century Europe. Most Americans have been brainwashed to think that the British is tyrannical, that the British are abusers of power. But in fact, constitutional monarchy and the fact that the Parliament has the power of the purse and has been recognized as the supreme power in the British government system in the wake of the late 17th century Glorious Revolution makes the British system the best, the fairest, the most progressive, the most future looking of any of the major European governments of the era. So that is where Franklin is betting his money. Of course, he's so clever, he will land on his feet and restore himself to good graces, but not before really skirting danger, as he does everything in his power to keep the colonies in the British Empire. That is very much what Franklin wants until the early 1770s, when events escape him and he ends up becoming a Johnny-come-lately patriot. The next figure is Joseph Brant, who I think is sort of famous as a Mason. This is a portrait that was painted for him on one of his diplomatic visits to England when he met with the king. There's all sorts of interesting things to say about Joseph Brant. I could go on at length. I will say that Brant, he is a multilingual person. He helps to translate scripture into his native Mohawk language. He is a military leader among the Mohawk. He is also a person who in ordinary times wore European clothing. He puts on this sort of mixed Indian outfit for this painting that he has done by the royal portrait painter for the king in the 1770s to portray a certain image that worked for him for the sake of this image.
You said
the next image is Sir Henry Clinton. Of course, he is the British commander-in-chief for the final years of the American Revolution. I'm just going to say I think he's a likely Mason, but I wasn't really able to pin that down with my insufficient research. And of course, George Washington, the most famous patriot, the most famous Mason of the era, presumably. So the breadth of worlds that Masonry embraced in the late 18th century is a striking feature of your institution. And the fact that it did so in a period of enormous polarization and political violence is all the more striking. Now that was, I think, made possible by a sense of a culture of honor and also a sort of sense of masculinity that helped individuals like these bridge all sorts of other divisions that were really challenging and difficult and violently divided ones in the late 18th century. So that's my last slide. I'm happy to talk more or send us all off into our coffee break or lunch break or whatever might come next. So thanks a lot for coming today and for your participation.
Thanks a lot, Liam. That was fantastic. We do have a couple questions from the floor. I know I'm going to shut off your sharing so we can all see each other. One question going back to a point that we kind of skimmed over, and I did have a question about this too, but posted by Chris, a few more details on the expulsion of the Acadians. I know that I think there was some rejection of them by the English colonists, and they continued to push them south. Obviously, you still have the influence in Louisiana, and I'm not sure if that's from them having been pushed across the water or actually across the continent or, down the river. But, you get the Acadian and the Cajun population down in Louisiana also. Can you talk a little bit about that? And again, were the Acadians carrying Masonry influence down there as they traveled?
All right, great question. So the Acadian diaspora is really incredible. And it does really underscore that other point we've discussed about the extraordinary far-flung transportation and communication networks of the 18th century, right? We might tend to think about colonists as isolated farmers with little connection with one another in a very rural situation, but the colonial society was a world on the move. Right? These are people who, if not them personally, their ancestors had a tremendous transatlantic movement to even get them into a colonial circumstance. And so they are well aware of the opportunities to come from geographic mobility. Now, the Acadian diaspora, of course, begins in an incredible moment of trauma. And about 7,000 people are forced off their farms, mostly around the Bay of Fundy in 1755. And they are forcibly removed to more southerly British colonies. And their reception in those colonies varies a great deal. In some places, they were able to integrate. In other places, they were rejected and put on ships to go elsewhere. And it does begin a period of counter-migration as well. Acadians were forced out, but some of them do begin a return to Acadia right from 1755. The other thing that's occurring is that so the British in this first roundup in 1755 get just under 50% of the population that they force out, but other French-speaking Acadians flee to those adjacent French territories. In particular, the modern colony province of Prince Edward Island is French at this point, so several thousand go there. Unfortunately, as the 7 Years' War unfolds, the British expand their military aggression into those areas of Acadie, and another 3,000 are expelled from French territories that are about to fall as part of the 7 Years' War. Now, those captives, the British deport to France. So there's a certain logic there. the French speakers who are in British Nova Scotia, they deport to other British territories. The Acadians they capture in French territory, which is not going to be French too much longer, they expel to France. And then that large group that goes to France begins some fascinating migrations to different regions of France, but also to French colonies in the Caribbean, to French Guiana on the coast of South America, even a settlement to the Falkland Islands, where the French were trying to create a colony. So this is, if not quite a global diaspora, it is a transatlantic one of a scope that is much larger than we might think. The arrival of Acadians to Louisiana does begin pretty early, with some in 1756, a couple of hundred who have been deported to Georgia, do continue a voluntary migration at this point to French Louisiana. But the big impulse of the arrival of Acadians to Louisiana is via France in 1785. About 2,000 have been a decade or two in France and are now resettling in Louisiana. And it's those Acadians who will be the sort of principal core of what we think of as Cajun culture in Louisiana today. My suspicion is that there was no Masonry among Acadians. I just can't imagine that these French-speaking communities in British Nova Scotia in the 18th century, who are descended from 17th century French colonial ancestors, seems unlikely to me that they would have encountered Masonry. More likely would be that as part of the deportation to France, some of them could have caught up with sort of cosmopolitan, Francophile Masonic elements, and that could have brought them back to Louisiana at a later date.
Jessica, did you have any response to that? Do you know about the
Yeah. First of all,
Masonry
that
in
was
France?
excellent summary of the Acadian dispersal and the transatlantic nature of their experience. I totally agree. I don't think that the Acadians in Acadie would have had, they barely had churches, and they were Catholics. They were practicing Catholics, but in a very practical sort of way. And they didn't have the civic infrastructure that would have lent itself to Freemasonry. In addition to those who went to France, perhaps encountering it there are some Acadians who seek to come back into Britain's good graces in the 60s, 70s, and beyond. And so maybe if they come back into the now British settled Nova Scotia, they would see in Freemasonry a way to enter that society. But there's not a lot of evidence of Freemasonry among that population.
Okay, to stick to our schedule, we have time maybe for just one or two more quick questions. If anybody has a question, now's a good time.
I do have one, but I'll wait until the members have a chance to go.
I just have a quick comment, and not really a question, but you probably noticed from Liam's first slide that he's a professor at the University of Maine right here in Orono. But a lot of people don't know he's also quite an adventurer, because last year we went from the middle of Sebec Lake all the way down the Sebec River to Milo with a group in a canoe trip. And Liam, he is a heck of a canoeist. I am very glad that for most of that trip, he was in front of my canoe, dragging my butt down through those rips and everything for me. So.
Very fun day. Thanks.
Any other questions from the floor? All right, Jessica, I think you had a question.
Yeah, so when I teach colonial American history, colonial British American history, I have to spend time and sort of letting my students know that there was such a place as Canada. We have like Canadian history awareness days in my classes. And I was just wondering if, this connects back to the discussion earlier about National History Day and your chapters up there, and your experience teaching students from Maine, high school students who come into Maine universities. Do they also need to be taught Canadian history and have an awareness of it, the as you say, the Maine being on the fault line of these empires?
Yeah, it's a mix, of course. There are certainly many people in Maine who are well aware of these interconnections, and it's part of their family history and their community history. So in a lot of ways, it is inescapable for many Mainers. But like so many things, we often don't stop to think about it. So, they get kind of compartmentalized in different ways. And, it would not be unusual to have a student, really have a sort of deeply nationalist sense of what Maine is. But then you talk about them or get to know them a little bit. And it turns out their grandmother speaks French, and it turns out they have, cousins who live in New Brunswick. And so, I do find the power of the nation to define how we think about ourselves and how we think about history in particular is, it's part of what has made this recent generation of Atlantic history so exciting, because it sort of has peeled back a layer, a fair bit of which you just say, oh, of course that's right. I just hadn't quite thought about it or looked at it that way. So those can be the best moments of teaching Maine students, when they think what you're talking about is just ludicrous, and then something comes out in a conversation and they're like, oh yeah, that is true. Not just true of history, but true of my family.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Liam. We really, really appreciate it. Oh, most worshipful, you have a question?
Oh, no, I just want to bring up a point that I do have family in Canada. I am still a fluent French-speaking Mainer. And as I see on a daily basis in my office as a chiropractor, we are gradually losing that sense of where we came from here in this neck of the woods. When we consider that many of our descendants here in Lewiston, at least, are from Canada, who migrated this way to work in the mill town, and a lot of that, being a French-speaking Mainer, Maina as we call them. It's not going to be long before our young students completely forget, unless they read the book, where our roots are and how the movement from Canada into the Northeast here in Maine originated. It's really, in my eyes, it's sad that will happen, but that will happen sooner than we know. And but anyways, I just wanted to plug that a little bit. And English was a second language for me. And so being here in Maine, I'm still proud of those Canadian roots that I have. So.
And my family has the same background too. The one thing I'll say about New England towns, though, is especially in the mill towns, you still see a lot of Franco societies, Franco-American societies. And so I think there is some attempt to hold on to some of that culture. Although I agree, I don't know how long it will last, which is too bad. Okay, thank you very much, Liam. We really, really appreciate your discussion today. It was great to see both the influence of English-based Masonry as well as understanding the trade and the society that was underlying it. So fantastic job, and thank you to both of you. We really appreciate this. At this time, fantastic hands and claps. At this time, I believe I will be handing it over to Most Worshipful Claire Tush and George. for a specific ceremony here. So I will hand the floor to you.
Thank you, Dan. As we discussed, can you get Dick Fletcher and I on a split screen?
Yes, I will work on that here. Just continue, and I'll do this at the split screen.
All righty. Well, we have a special treat this morning, special honor for Brother Dick Fletcher and myself. We've been trying to do this since about January or February, and COVID made some, obviously created some challenges. For those of you that don't know Brother Richard Fletcher, Dick Fletcher, he's past Grand Master of Vermont, and has been he and his wife Judy actually have been the face of the Masonic Services Association up until his retirement just recently, just a few years ago. He's an incredibly dedicated man, and he is a board member of the Philalethes Society. It's relevant to what we're presenting today to Most Worshipful Brother Walter McDougall. How are you coming, Dan? Are we
almost there? I've got the feature. Dick, what's your the screen name that you're using?
iPad.
Then yes, I should have you both pinned. Can people actually see both people? Anybody?
not singularly? No.
We can see them, but everybody else too.
Dan, he's still muted. And so when he's unmuted, then he'll become the featured, I think.
Can you unmute, Dick?
I pushed the button. Do you hear me?
We hear you.
Okay. A good thumbs up. Shall we do it now? I'm not sure if the screen is split. Mine isn't, but I'm happy to go ahead.
We see you.
Walter, Walter, I haven't seen you yet, but I'm just so very proud that Philalethes allowed me this honor of being in the presentation of some really, really most deserved and oh gosh, we go back so far, but it's an honor to be able to present these to you. And the Philalethes Society is recognizing some of your great work, because as much as you are in Maine, your shadow goes far beyond the borders of the state of Maine. It goes, in fact, worldwide. And you have been a mentor and a friend to so many Masons, me included, that it's just a pleasure to be able to say to you, Philalethes is recognizing you for the just outstanding work you have done for Freemasonry. And the first of these, the Philalethes Society. The executive board of the Philalethes Society, with full confidence in the morals, character, and Masonic abilities of our brother, Walter M. McDougall, and because of his outstanding scholarship and service to the society and Freemasonry in general, do hereby recognize and honor him by conferring the style and title of Fellow of the Philalethes Society, and highly recommend him to all Masons wheresoever dispersed on the face of the earth as a worthy Freemason of great skill and good morals, tried and true, and a lover of the entire fraternity. And I'm very pleased that Past Grand Master Claire is there to make the actual presentation. As he presents that to you, he will follow it with the medal of your designation as a fellow of the fraternity, of the Philalethes.
Well, Walter, it's with great pleasure and honor that I have the opportunity to present this to you. You are the 227th fellow in the 90-year history of this recognition and award, and only the 4th in Maine. You are the predecessors. Most recently were Ed King in 2001, Charlie Glassmeyer, I believe, in '88, and Benjamin Ela in 1968. So it's with a great deal of pleasure, Walter, and a great honor that I invest you with this jewel and provide you with this patent from the Philadelphia Society.
Thank you very much. And that's
It
a
is
privilege
my-
to have you,
oh, most-
both Dick and you, here to present this. Thank you.
We've been working hard to get here, Walter. But we're not done yet, my friend.
We're not quite done yet, Walter. When I was with MSA, one of the great joys I had was editing the Short Talk Bulletin, and I can tell you I was always pleased when I got one from you, because they're always so enormously popular. And of course, your writings well, they're just known worldwide because you're just that kind of a Mason. So the Philadelphia Society, the executive board of the Philadelphia Society, with gratitude for the outstanding contributions our brother has made to Masonic research and education, do hereby announce the award of literature for the year 2019 is bestowed upon Brother Walter M. McDougall for the most outstanding article contributed to the Philadelphia's magazine, showing original scholarship supported and documented by research related to the history, traditions, literature, and concepts of Freemasonry. And the presentation is going to be made to you right now, again, by Brother Clare.
And again, Walter, it's with great, we need to let Judy be able to catch this too. It's with great pleasure that we present this to you. It's a great article.
Thank you.
I've read it several times.
Thank you very much. Thank you indeed.
And just speaks to what we in Maine know of you, but the rest of the world does too. For there are the fellows of the Philadelphia Society span the globe. They're in every continent of the world over the last 90 years.
It's a great honor. Thank you very much.
I couldn't go to a better man. So I will step aside.
Walter, I see the tie, but I may see the kilt, so I'd hardly recognize you. But would you favor us with a few words?
How do you want me, George?
Can we see you?
Just like you are.
By the way, Arthur and Malcolm are on here.
We need to.
Congratulations, Walter.
Thank you very much.
And then there we go.
I deeply appreciate and am grateful for the honor that my Masonic brethren of the Philadelphia Society have given, and I'm reminded that I must get to work if I am to meet the expectations at all. The erudite and gifted Mason, Walter Leslie Wilmshurst, wrote, "What seems now needed to intensify the worth and usefulness of this great brotherhood is to deepen its understanding in its own system, to educate its members in the deeper meaning and true purposes of its rites and its philosophy." That statement holds today as solidly as it did when it was written. I keep finding the streams of Masonry run far more deeply than I had realized. They run old, but they run fresh with wisdom and new inspiration. If Brother Wilmshurst were writing today, he might have added how much Freemasonry is needed in the 21st century, with its focus on building knowledge, its affinity for the arts and the sciences, with its powerful teaching symbols, its insistence on caring, and its emphasis on rationality and positive relationships. Out of the Masonic past burst light and inspiration for each new generation, faced as it will be with problems which must be solved and tasks which must be done. During the rebuilding of a stone bridge which arches across the River Shannon in the Irish town of Limerick in the year 1830, a small square was discovered in one of the abutments. The square is engraved with the date 1507 and bears the following inscription: I strive to live with love and care upon the level and by the square. Briefly and eloquently, that line proclaims our intention for all seasons and all times. Masonry has been working in the quarries of humanity and sharing discoveries for centuries. That fact helps explain why we Freemasons find insights in our profession expressed so widely. I've been reading Stephen Covey's, that's Stephen M.R. Covey, the son of the famous Stephen Covey, who has written so much on business and on leadership. Stephen Covey's best-selling book, The Speed of Trust. It is a manual for leaders in business and managers of corporations, but I am sure that Covey would say that is for everyone, because it is about relationships, and especially the key human relationship of trust. Freemasons reading this book will feel at home, as would our ancient Grand Master Hiram Abiff. Covey convincingly asserts that the agency of trust is pragmatic, tangible, and actionable. Trust may be built, lost, and rebuilt again. Morality is not only critical to all human affairs, it is central. Platonic virtues have the same relevance in Covey's text as they do in Masonic ritual. The principles of Freemasonry live. Increasing numbers of scholars inside and outside the fraternity are discovering the wisdom and moral force which resides in Freemasonry's story of the builder. I have found myself thinking of the beginning of modern Freemasonry when Preston and Hutchinson and others found an endangered treasure of method, principle, and allegory in the old but disappearing operative lodges. There existed then, as there does now, a risk that a most valuable pathway to a better world would be lost. Realizing this possibility, these men went to work. It is a privilege to take even a small part in our Freemasonry. A Freemasonry rediscovered and responsibly active in the 21st century. With a full heart, my brethren, I thank you.
Congratulations from everybody, most worshipful. I'm always amazed by how well read and how well spoken you are, and you hold us to a high academic standard. So I thank you for the work that you have done and continue to do with the Maine Masonic College. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Congratulations, Dad.
Hi, Malcolm. Thank you. My son, Malcolm.
Fantastic. All right, so coming up on schedule at 11:30, and with Worshipful Masters Richard Nato's permission, I would like us to take one more short break here and recommence at 11:30 for your closing remarks and the video, if you'd like to show that. Fantastic. The video will be ready when we come back, and I will hand it over to Worshipful Master at 11:30. So see you in about 7 minutes, everybody. Right now, I wanted to hand the floor over to Most Worshipful, Richard Nato, who had some comments, I believe, on either today's events or even about the anniversary of Freemasonry in Maine.
Well, thank you. I certainly am pleased to be here with all of you today. I thank you again so much to all the regents and all of you involved in the continued education that we're able to put out for our brethren and non-brethren alike. We've spoken an awful lot about where we've come from and centuries past, but I'd like to bring us more into the 21st century. Not unlike other times in Masonic history, are we facing adversity, and particularly since the advent of COVID, which I guess will be known as the COVID Masons for a while. This adversity has actually caused us to think out of the box a bit. I have been to many lodges and listened to many brethren. I've had the opportunity to recently speak and be a responder for the International Masonic Roundtable with 14 different Grand Masters of 14 different countries, from South Africa and India and Bulgaria and Lebanon and Manitoba. And no one is exempt from the adversity that we find ourselves in right now. I think that adversity, being the mother of invention, is proving to be true during this difficult time. We've come a long way, but yet we have still a long way to go. I think that Most Worshipful McDougall spoke eloquently, as he always does, and actually touched on a few of the key points that I was considering myself. I believe that the future of Freemasonry is bright. I believe that we have some struggles and we have some hurdles that we have to get over, but we'll do it and we'll do fine. What I'm particularly interested by, and when we talked earlier about the cost of dues and the cost of Masonic membership, if we look back not long ago, just post the Second World War, the average cost of membership in the lodge would be probably a week's wage for their annual dues for the brethren then. And what has occurred over time, I believe, is lodges have historically held down their dues in order to maintain membership, or they thought that probably members would tend to resign. And this really never happened, but we do find ourselves now paying the price for those artificially low dues and what we provide for our brethren in the lodges. The effect of the action over the years has been pretty steady. We've had a decline in membership, and I believe also that it's because we've lowered our standards a little bit. The quality of, for example, our festive boards, from rich banquets to now being cold sausage rolls and sandwiches and a soup, that really was part of the attraction of Freemasonry, along with the mystique of Freemasonry. We've gone away from that, and we're trying so much to accommodate everybody that we're taking just anybody as a member. We are, I want to say, playing to the lowest common denominator, and that has us struggling a bit for membership. My goal over the next couple of years is to help brethren to get over the fear of losing members and restore the value that our past members had in Freemasonry. I heard a little bit ago that we're a world on the move, and considering the adversity of the past, how could anyone really consider being prosperous during adversity? How would they continue to grow and advance? I think it was a sense of purpose and a sense of personal responsibility that actually caused that. We have lectures and we have programs and we have a number of things that our brethren can do, but our brethren seem to have forgotten what their value of Freemasonry actually is. When they come into a lodge hall and they listen to a lecture that has been rote memorized, but don't fully understand what the value of what they are doing is, those are the brethren who are going to slip through the cracks, and that's going to be a diminishing membership, which is going to force the lodge to create new ways to make members, and they'll probably be lowering the dues and dumbing down the standards of Freemasonry. I think that for our survival into the future really depends on us to bring the value back to each individual brother in the lodge. We all remember, those of us who are Masons here all remember that very first night that you walked into the lodge to do your first degree. And it was all a blur and it was a little bit confusing. And somebody probably sat you down and said, this is what this means. We don't seem to have the same mentors as we used to. And by losing that mentorship, we're losing membership. For example, when you first knocked on the door of the lodge, you heard from inside, who comes here? Who comes here is not Luke Shorty or Dan Goucher or Chris Pare. Who comes here is, who are you deep within yourself? If we force brethren to take a deep introspective look at themselves, where they can fully understand the question, who comes here? I believe that we'll be reestablishing value, and our membership woes will diminish in terms of numbers. One of the other questions that we hear in our first degree is, what came you here to do? That's a pretty deep question. It has a couple of parts to that response. Part of it's moral and part of it's philosophical. The moral part is to learn to subdue my passions. And the philosophical part is to improve myself in Masonry. But unless you dissect that question and look truly at what the answers are to that question within yourself, you'll never really be able to understand the value of that question. When part of that answer is to improve myself in Masonry, we know that the tenets of our profession are brotherly love, relief, and truth. But until you fully understand what that means, that will always be a philosophical response. When you understand what that means, then you can go ahead and respond to it in a moral way and understand where it comes from. Freemasonry doesn't come from a superficial part. It comes from a deep, much more, I don't want to say spiritual part, but it's a more heartfelt, internal part of what we do. And until we can restore the value in our brethren and help them to understand truly what Freemasonry is, then we're going to continue seeing our membership woes, and we will not be about the business of Freemasonry. Freemasonry is a pretty serious business in my mind, and the world could probably use us more than ever right now. We live in a fractured society. We live in a society where there's even more political, spiritual, cultural, and racial divide than probably we ever have. And we have the tools and the ability to mend some of those gaps and narrow that divide if we truly understand what the tenets of our profession are and put them into practice. The young men who are out there only raising money and doing fundraisers and trying to assist their communities, and that's all they know, are actually missing part and parcel what Freemasonry really is. We're not only a charitable foundation or a charitable man. We are part of a fraternity, and the fraternity needs the closeness so that it can work as a whole to bring to our communities and to today's civil world or uncivil world the lessons that we have to share. My mind goes all over the place when I think of this, because there's so much that can be said in the context of Freemasonry. And when I say Freemasonry, I don't mean just brotherly love, belief, and truth. I also mean the core values that exist in the Scottish Rite, the added lessons in the York Rite, the ceremony of lights in the Demolay, the initiatory degrees in Rainbow, and the spiritual lessons in the Eastern Star. These are all tools that we have at our disposal to bring to our society to help mend those fences that are broken. Now, for some reason, society still considers Freemasonry as a secret, and yet we have every building with the square and compasses on it, and a lighted sign that says what nights we meet and what we're going to be doing. However, among us as brethren, I believe we are the reason that it still seems secret to so many. I am not about advertising for myself just for recognition, but I am about bringing our tenets of our profession into our communities and letting them know where they come from, and letting them know that it's Masons who are doing this. I think, Brother Steve Nichols, I think I heard you at one time in an ad that we did for Maine Freemason, or for Freemasonry in Maine. And I think you said that when you were a youth, that the Masons were the movers and the shakers in your community, and everybody knew it. Am I correct? Did I quote that correctly? I think that that's where we need to be again today. We can go out and try our darndest to reinvent the wheel. We have all the tools that we need. We just need to put them to use. And I don't have any concerns about Freemasonry going away. I certainly don't. I do have some concerns about how we're portraying Freemasonry in the world today. I think that we can do a whole lot more to bring Freemasonry to light, and it starts with each one of us. I could go on and on and on, and I really think that the brothers who are joining us today fully understand that, and fully understand where we're coming from. Masonry is not going away. I'm really happy with Masonry in Maine. We have overcome many obstacles in the past, and the obstacle that we face right now in terms of COVID and some of the other political and whatever is going on in the world today, we have the tools to fix it. However, if we don't take those tools out of the box and use them, then it's going to be pretty difficult to continue this way. I would welcome anybody to challenge that thought. I believe that it can be done. This year was a little difficult. I'm going to back up a little bit. This year was a little difficult. We had several things planned. We had a trip to the Washington Memorial planned. We had a plan for the Oklahoma Native American degree team to come to Maine to do some degree work. We had 400 seats reserved at the Sea Dogs ball game for Maine Day. I had brethren from my lodge working on an extremely large float for the 200th anniversary of Maine and Maine Masonry for the parade. And those things have been put on hold. But I've watched the brethren who were saddened by the fact that those things went away until next year, hopefully, just come up with other ways to promote Freemasonry. We love this fraternity. The brethren love the fraternity, and we just need to talk about it with our communities more than we do, so that it doesn't continue to be the best kept secret that there is. It's not secret. I think, Jessica, you did all the research. You know it's not secret. A couple of points of recognition, perhaps. But other than that, we have what the world needs. And I would welcome any questions or concerns from anybody at this point. I told you I would keep it brief. I'm not going to have a large and a long dissertation, because those of you who know me know that I can probably rattle on for quite some time. But anyways, that's the message I have is we've overcome adversity before. We're facing some adversity now. It's a challenge, but we'll get over it. We're all in it together. And regardless of what that challenge is, I know that at least Maine Freemasonry will survive. It was very refreshing to hear the Grand Masters from the other countries reiterate the same thing. Everybody around the globe is experiencing the similar difficulties as we are. Yet, every one of these Grand Masters that I had the opportunity to speak with has that passion, that love for Freemasonry, and the desire to make the world a better place. And it's really, it's heartwarming for me to know that I am a part, just a small part of that. So.
Thank you, Most Worshipful. That's fantastic and inspiring. It's interesting too how, you know, today we've looked at that foundation of history and some of the challenges that Masonry has crossed over time. And, you know, we're at a crossroads again, as you say, but Masonry has always made it through. And I think, like you're saying, we'll, you know, take on these challenges right now and continue to carry forward the craft and its many benefits. So I would like to start our closing of today's convocation. I would point out that on the Grand Lodge website is that amazing video that covers the 200th anniversary of Masonry. If you get a chance, go over. It's right on the front page of the Grand Lodge of Maine, and take a look at it. It runs about 30 minutes and it covers a myriad of subjects. So if you would like to know some more about the history specifically of Maine, go and take a look at that video. And then in closing, not only thanking everybody here who contributed to today's event, I would like to ask Dean Luke Shorty to just talk a little bit about how people can get some more information or be more involved with Maine Masonic College, and a little bit about when we do get back to a more normal schedule, what Maine Masonic College will be able to offer the different lodges and the state as a whole.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Great convocation overall today. Glad to be part of the celebration of Most Worshipful Walter McDougall and hearing those inspiring closing thoughts from the Grand Master, Richard Nadeau, and two awesome talks today. But if you are interested in what other programming that the Masonic College can bring to your lodge or to your area, you can find us at the following webpage. And that is www.tobringmorelight.org, which is what the Masonic College is all about, is to bring more light to the world. In so doing, if you do have any questions or suggestions or want to connect with us, emailing us at info@tobringmorelight.org will be a quick way to get in touch with us. And like I had said at the beginning, we will be looking at rolling out our courses again starting in January, assuming that it is safe and prudent to do so. We're also working on having some of our presentations, like what you're seeing today, being recorded for posterity. So those who weren't able to attend today will have the opportunity to see some of the great talks and lectures that we were part of this day and what we'll experience during our spring celebration of arts and sciences. And hopefully we'll have a way of delivering some of our courses to you using today's technology with yesterday's timeless and important lessons that we offer as a college. So with that, I will turn it back over to you, Mr. Chair, if you have any other closing remarks.
I believe that concludes today's convocation then, and great convocation for 2020. Most worshipful NATO, anything else that you would like to add as a closing remark? You get the last word.
You know what? Usually my wife gets the last word, but I'll take advantage of that. No, I don't. I want to thank everybody for all the efforts that have been put in, especially since we can't meet face to face, and we didn't have our Floridians come to Maine and enjoy some of our crisp air, which is not 90 degrees right now. I especially want to personally congratulate Most Worshipful McDougall on an unbelievable accomplishment. And I can't think of anyone who is more deserving of that accolade. And I'm always inspired when I listen to you speak. And I suspect that you will continue to bring inspiration to me and to all of Freemasonry wherever you go. So again, congratulations on your accomplishments. And Brother Chair, I give the floor back to you.
Thank you very much. I hope everybody has a great rest of the weekend, and keep in touch with the Maine Masonic College. There's a lot of resources there for you, and we'd love to speak with you. So thank you very much, everybody. Have a good rest of the weekend.